My name is Rick Savage. I'm the chairman of the Harbor Committee. And I'm going to call the meeting to order at this time. The first item on our agenda is to approve minutes for previous meetings, June 14th, September 6th, 2022.
I make a motion, we accept them as written.
Seconded.
Second.
We'll vote by raising a hand or say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Okay, welcome to our meeting tonight. This is a big turnout for a Harbor Committee meeting, I'll tell you that. It's a public hearing from the South Shore Cove Association's appeal of the Northeast Harbor Town of Mount Desert Harbor Master, I'm sorry, John, decision to grant 4 moorings at for the Northeast Harbor Fleet at South Shore Cove. I'm going to open the meeting for the presentation from the South Shore Cove Association. I would ask that if people have questions, they direct them through the chair. I'm going to ask questions and answers to be limited to 3 minutes, if possible, from the public. I would like everybody who wants to speak to raise a hand, and you should be identified. Identify yourself, and we'll proceed in that kind of fashion. So right now we have some information from our representative, Patrick Lyons. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Lyons. I'm the town's attorney. Tonight I'm going to be advising the Harbor Committee in their capacity in hearing this appeal. So I just want to address a few pre-hearing issues. For the record, the Harbor Committee has jurisdiction to hear this appeal pursuant to section 4.1 of its Harbor Ordinance. And the association is standing to file this appeal, and it was filed timely pursuant to section 4.1 of the Harbor Ordinance. The Harbor Committee is conducting a de novo hearing of this appeal. The association filed written material consistent with the deadlines set out in the notice of the meeting, including exhibits, written arguments, and the proposed order. A duly noticed site visit of South Shore Cove and the moorings at issue was conducted via vote on September 6, 2022. Members of the Harbor Committee, the Harbor Master, members of the association, members of the public were in attendance. Tonight, the association is represented by legal counsel Stephen Wagner. The Harbor Master is appearing on his own behalf, and as I mentioned, I, Patrick Lyons, am here tonight serving as the advisor to the Harbor Committee. The meeting is being recorded via Zoom, and public participation is available via Zoom and in person. The format is the association will have 2 hours to present evidence and argument, followed by questions of the, as Rick had mentioned, he wants the Harbor Committee to be able to ask questions. Rick, it's up to you, but I think you may want to wait for the public to be able to ask questions until the end if you'd like to do that. I think that might make for more.
Okay.
But if the Harbor Committee has questions during the presentations, I think it makes sense if you want, if that's what Rick wants to ask them.
I have a comment about that. If the presentation is long, I would like questions to be asked at the appropriate time at that time for an issue, so that it doesn't get lost in other information.
Certainly. That makes sense. I need to want to see.
Okay.
But then I think questions from the public of the association or the Harbor Master should wait till they have them.
That's fine.
Okay. Following that, the Harbor Master will present evidence, an argument, and then questions from the Harbor Committee, and then the association, and then the public, if there are any. Then, because the moorings were issued to the fleet, members of the fleet will be able to present argument here tonight regarding the moorings. And then last any members of the public that aren't a member of the association or the fleet may provide public comment. And we ask that we limit those to 3 minutes per individual. Then the hearing will be closed and the Harbor Committee will deliberate. If, depending on how long we go tonight, the Harbor Committee may table deliberations till a subsequent meeting, but we're gonna do our best and see where we're at here. And if we can deliberate and decide tonight on the issues, great, but that's an option. A few other housekeeping issues. The Harbor Committee Chair is the presiding officer of this hearing. He has the authority to rule upon issues of evidence, regulate the course of the hearing, rule on issues of procedure, and take any other actions that may be necessary for an efficient and orderly hearing here tonight. And then one last housekeeping issue before we allow the association to present their case. I want to address any potential issues of conflicts of interest or bias. Any members of the Harbor Committee should divulge whether they believe they may have a conflict of interest or bias regarding the subject matter of this appeal. Specifically, whether they believe any relationship or history regarding the subject matter of this appeal or the parties involved impacts the ability to be fair or impartial. Hearing none, then we will Chair Savage, it's all yours.
Yes, okay. We will begin the presentation from the representatives of the South Shore Committee. And please identify yourself so that everyone knows who you are and who you represent.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just stand briefly to say I'm Stephen Wagner with Brother Winchell here today on behalf of the South Shore Cove Association. And if it's all right with the board, I think it'd be easier to navigate all the papers if I say.
Fine.
Okay. So as I said, I represent the South Shore Cove Association. This is a group of individuals, and you've received the names of the individuals, and I represent both the association and the individuals themselves for purposes of this hearing. And the association consists of shoreland owners along South Shore Cove, and along the area that we're calling South Shore Cove, as well as owners of property with views of the shoreline. And overall, the group is dedicated to the preservation and stewardship of the cove that they very closely value. On appeal specifically now, as you know from my written materials, is the Harbor Master's decision from June to give final approval for Northeast Harbor permits, Northeast Harbor fleet permits 293, 294, 295, and 296. And our request on appeal, as Attorney Lyons laid out for you, that this board has the authority to affirm, modify, or set aside a decision of the Harbor Master, and it sits de novo. And so our request is that you reverse the decision to grant the permits, or in the alternative, you decide to grant our request to change the location outside of South Shore Cove. Couple points in the interim, and again, I won't repeat at length what's in our briefs, but I just want to briefly summarize before I present our witnesses and evidence to the board. One point I want to make is that while on appeal, we're dealing with 4 moorings that were granted approval. The record shows, and I think the responses from both the fleet and the association demonstrate that really this is part of a larger proposal to develop the cove with over 30 moorings. And so
this is going to be a long meeting. For myself, I don't want to get into what could happen. If you're appealing what could happen, I feel that's a waste of our time. So let's concentrate on the 4 moorings and not go into something that may or may not happen.
Sure, I understand that perspective, and so let me just clarify. We are only appealing the 4 moorings. I will be speaking to the 4 moorings. However, our evidence will pertain to all of that, and I think it's necessary for the committee to take that perspective, but I recognize your point, and I can move on. I think it's important to recognize that this is not an attack on the harbor master's decision, and I think how to frame this again, this is a de novo. The harbor master didn't have all of the evidence that will be presented before you tonight. And sitting in a de novo hearing, you are looking at this issue essentially fresh, and you're applying the relevant standards based on the evidence before you. So while we certainly disagree with some aspects of Harbor Master Lemoyne's decision, this is not a situation where we are saying that you need to determine that he was wrong and you need to disapprove his decision. It's based on the evidence before you. Apply that to the relative standards here, 7.4, 7.18, and 2.3, to determine whether these moorings should be permitted and should remain in South Shore. As I mentioned, the ordinance standards we're dealing with here are 7.4, 7.18, and 2.3. I will just summarize them briefly to say that essentially you would consider the safety and current uses of the entire current uses by the entire public to determine if the moorings are in the best interests of the town and fairly and efficiently promote the availability and use of a limited and valuable public resource. Legally, this is fairly straightforward. The legal arguments here are laid out in the briefs. I won't go over them, but suffice to say, we have 2 reasons for this appeal. The first, for that the moorings should not be issued consistent with the standards of 7.4 and 18 and 2.3. Because they detract from the order and the tidal waters, jeopardize the safety and use of the tidal waters by the general public. And the decision to grant them in the way that they were does not lead to a fair and efficient use of the limited public resource. So you will hear evidence tonight from 3 subject matter experts, starting with Gordon Longsworth, who will speak to the Cove being geographically distinct and the history of a lack of development in the Cove. You will hear from Representative Paul Sokoloff from Stantec, a firm that dove on the Cove and discovered eelgrass habitats and ledge habitat, and that relates to the standard of whether this interferes with current uses, which are dependent on the habitats that the Cove supports. And you will also hear from Captain Robert Peacock on matters of safety and best practices concerning mooring placement. Additionally, you have before you the written testimony of members of the committee and members of the public. I also have just a small handful of members that we're going to very, very briefly go through just a couple factual issues that are present in their written testimony. And so before we dive into that, I just want to address a few comments that were made in responses that you'll hear from the fleet based on their responses that I want to address up front. There's talk of concessions that were made in terms of the proposal. I think it's important to recognize, as the board member has already pointed out, there is no larger proposal before this committee right now. So the idea that there can be concessions is simply really isn't relevant. We need to deal with what's before the board now. And then I want to address the notion that this is a typical not in my backyard type case. I'm a land use attorney. I'm often sitting in Attorney Lyon's position advising boards. I see a lot of NIMBYism and these sort of things. I'm going to assert to you this is a very distinct situation. And here we have it's not your neighbor's yard that you could have bought and stop something from happening, and you didn't, and now you're just trying to stop someone from doing what they're lawfully entitled to do. Rather, this is a public resource, and it's a public resource that should be managed in accordance with the purposes of the ordinance. Furthermore, the cove, as the evidence will show, is distinct and has unique conditions that would not be applicable to many other areas of Northeast Harbor. So, and finally, as has been pointed out, the association members, many of them are members of the fleet. You know, and I think that this doesn't speak to NIMBYism. If anything, that's compelling evidence of how strongly these concerns are felt. That members of the association, even if they were to directly or indirectly benefit from these moorings, feel that nonetheless, because of the reasons that they presented, it's not in the best interests of the community. So unless there are any immediate questions on those arguments, I'm going to go right into the evidence. Okay, I'm going to start with you, Mr. Longsworth. Could you just state your name for the record and introduce who you are to the committee?
Sure. My name is Gordon Longsworth, and I'm here as the cartographer that was asked to be a consultant on the project. And I did some mapping work and looked at some aerial photos to try to answer some of the questions that the South Shore Association had. And I'm here and prepared to answer any questions that anyone may have about that.
And Kyle, can I ask you to turn to Exhibit A on the PDF? Yeah, so sorry, if you scroll up, go up, Gordon Longsworth exhibits, Exhibit A right there. Yep, thank you. And so, Mr. Longsworth, can you describe what we're looking at here, and feel free to give direction to scroll up or down, and we'll
Maybe scroll down a bit. Well, the first image is the shape there is, of course, the town of Mount Desert with a satellite image. Then the sources are listed later on in terms of the, you know, where that came from. So maybe scroll down so that we can see the whole cove.
And so this is a map that you prepared based off of the description of the code from the association.
Yes, and just visually by looking at the geographic layout of the area. And to just see to do what seemed to make sense in terms of where those lines should be. And to make it as rational as possible to have the descriptions. You know, you see the bottom line going due east and west instead of some funny angle. So just try to do something when it's written out in text that's as understandable as possible. And that's a pretty recent satellite image. The dates and the sources are here. I think it's 2020.
Kyle, could you go back to the bookmark page of the PDF there? Okay. And why don't we go to Exhibit C, please? The bio, yeah. So Gordon, can you just briefly explain just your background, why that qualifies you to prepare these maps and describe the geography of the cove?
Sure. Well, my day job is the GIS director at the College of the Atlantic. I am not here in that capacity. I'm here as a private consultant. So what I say, it has nothing to do with College of the Atlantic. I was a student at COA back in the late 80s when we founded the GIS lab. So that's when I got my start. I've been doing this 30 or 35 years, teaching since 1993. And in fact, years ago, prepared a lot of the maps, zoning maps, tax maps, things that Chicago was updated and improved over the years. Excuse me, since way back then. So I'm pretty familiar with the area and the kinds of data and the things that people have done with it. What information is useful for and what it may not be.
Okay.
My role is to be just sort of a neutral party, simply representing the data in a neutral sort of a way.
Great, thank you. Kyle, could you, sorry, go back to the, yep, and you scroll down to, nope, sorry, Exhibit C, South Shore Cove map and photo presentation. And click on, or Gordon, can I ask you, is this the report that you created?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and Kyle, sorry, if you can go back, yes, exactly, that's the page. So Gordon, can you summarize your findings?
Can I read that?
You can read that, expound upon if you'd like.
Yeah, so I found that looking at aerial photography back to about 1970. Before that, the clarity wasn't good enough to really determine anything. 1970 was pretty, good photography, and so about 52 years, there was no signs of really any development in the cove. There was no piers, there was no moorings, really, frankly, nothing. In the intertidal or out in the water that I was able to see from the photos, and all those photos are included in the report, so anybody can go through and see what they see.
And can I ask, is there, how frequent are the photos? Were you able to see a year by year play, or the gaps, or?
I think it was at least every 10 years.
1981 was the next one after 1970.
And there was not photography necessarily available for every year.
And so the next part of your report, I understand it goes into, and actually, Kyle, could you step back on the bookmark, please? And if you can scroll down. You go to the photo history 1970 to present. And Kyle, if you wouldn't mind just scrolling down, about that pace. So Gordon, what we're looking at here, the satellite photos you're able to obtain from 1970, obviously not satellites, right?
That's from the aerial taken from an aircraft. Obviously, it's black and white film. And I was able to, on the computer, zoom in much more closely, down to the real granularity of the photo. And I looked quite carefully and wasn't able to see any structures.
Kyle, can I have you go back to the bookmark? And go to context photos, a little bit down. Yep, right there. So, Mr. Longsworth, we had asked you to compare your findings there about South Shore Cove and the lack of development, and put it in context of what we see along the shoreline in Northeast Harbor. Can you summarize what you did there and your findings?
Essentially, I zoomed in and followed all of the shoreline, looking for any sorts of development in terms of piers, structures like that used to access the water. And I just labeled some of the coves here, but I examined the entire saltwater coastline of the town.
So actually, Kyle, could you scroll down a couple pages? So Gordon, can you actually go back? Will you tell me, Mr. Longsworth, what does this slide show? And feel free to tell me to go to a different slide to help you explain to the committee your findings.
So the areas with D are where I did find development, piers, docks, things like that. And then the U's are coves which were undeveloped. And several of the undeveloped coves appear that they would not be accessible to boats just because they're mud flats and clam flats and not really places that would be suitable anyway.
Sure. So can you go to the next page, Kyle? And so what do those red dots indicate?
That's a buffer around the piers that I did find. So when I saw a pier, I simply put a point. I wasn't able to trace the exact outline like you'd get on a plan or something like that. But if I saw a pier, I put a point and then created a buffer around it, otherwise you would not be able to see the point. So those are exaggerated in terms of the real world size, but the idea was to paint a picture of the amount of this kind of shoreline development that is present in the town. And that photo is the 2020 satellite image that spoke about
You
it.
can go to the next page. And the page after that. So, Mr. Longsworth, can you put this in context? How does this make South Shore Cove significant?
It's like the last pristine, undeveloped cove in the town of Mount Desert, as far as I can tell. I think that's the bottom line. I couldn't find anywhere else in the town that was as pristine as this cove, and certainly not at such a large scale, you know, which is really significant.
So did you get a sense of either from your analysis here or certainly your personal experience on the island, the current uses of this cove? And do you think a marina, an expanded fleet field of moorings is consistent with those current uses?
Well, if we can imagine several docks or piers in there, and I would continue the process that you see in the other red dots, and I put a point that, you know, you'd end up with more spheres of influence, you know. Excuse me. Such as the red circles you see in the other areas.
And so, Mr. Longsworth, did you also review the proposal from the Northeast Harbor Fleet for the 4 moorings and as well as the additional moorings?
I saw the map plans.
Can we step out to the bookmarks again? South Shore Cove proposal. That's right, yeah. So this is what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. And so do you think that this sort of proposal to locate moorings in here 4 or more, do you think that's consistent with the certainly the current uses?
No. If the current use is basically a natural resource.
And would, if this development came through as proposed, would your conclusion still be that South Shore Cove remains uniquely undeveloped as compared to the rest of
If
the?
there were 4 or more moorings put in, is that the question?
Yeah, I mean, does this proposal take away from your conclusion that based on your comparative analysis of development, this is uniquely undeveloped?
It's uniquely undeveloped, and it would move it towards, you know, how the rest of the shoreline in the town is, where it's developed, and you have lots of moorings and anchorages and things like that, where currently there's none here now. So I would say that any, even one, would be a significant change to the nature of the code.
Kyle, can you step back to the bookmarks again? And the one that starts with brackets, distribute copies, exhibit K, Longsworth supplementary maps. Gordon, can you explain what these maps are? And
This is a combination of several things. We're back to the 2020 satellite image, still the same photo-based map. And the boundary, we've seen that before. And the red and yellow dots that you see here came from the plans. What were they? The plans from the fleet.
yes,
And so that picture that we saw earlier in the GIS software, I was able to bring in, and in GIS, the data is life size. That's what really makes it unique. You can measure, do analysis, things like that. And I was able to align the image.
Is this, this is all theoretical, right? The yellow dots is a proposal that the fleet could go to. And that's not what we're talking about tonight?
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, so let me clarify, these,
The manner. One, please don't, if you're not presenting, we don't want any interaction from the audience, because of hearing. And then two, I think to your point, you made the point that we're not considering that. Remember, but I think we should allow them to just, put this in context and present the evidence, in my advice.
Go ahead, Chris.
He wasn't privy to our executive session where we met with you.
Yeah, okay, all right.
So I don't know if should talk to any members that weren't present or.
Sure, I think unless, I think we just let them present this and then you
Okay.
guys understand what's before you. You can kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. If you don't think something is relevant, you don't have to consider it in your determination. But I believe, for efficiency's sake of the hearing, and it is their appeal, allow them to present their evidence as they have designed.
So to keep it simple and brief, it's simply an overlay that was created from the image, which I was able to align. And then I just clicked in these dots where they were on the image, and that's,
sorry, Gordon, let me just.
Yeah.
The overlay on top of this comes from the Stantec report, and this is showing the eelgrass bed habitats that were found on a dive on the Cove this summer, as well as the ledge habitats, is that right?
yes, those are the GIS files that I received from Stantec, and all I did was just bring them into the map and give them the symbology.
And to clarify, the four red circles are the only moorings that are here on appeal, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question. Why didn't you record any water depths?
Because I wasn't asked to do so. However, I did include a picture of the nautical NOAA chart, which has the depth on it.
In his report is a conclusion of the nautical depths. I have no further questions for you, so I will turn it to the committee.
Committee have any question?
I have one question, right? When we visited there last week, there were 4 moorings, what is it, 22 through 26 or whatever it is. And there was 1 boat on it. It was that, who was that rented to? Was that the association? Commodore,
Hi, Mia Thompson, I'm the Commodore of the Northern Harbor Fleet. There was a powerboat on one of those 4 moorings. Unfortunately, I do not know who owns that, but I can try to find that out for you and give an answer.
Well, the reason I asked, I was told, I don't know, maybe it was just hearsay, that it belonged to one of the people from the association. I'm just kind of curious why they put a boat up there if they don't want them out there.
Good question. That my understanding is that one of the members of the SSCA does rent one of those 4. I just don't know which one. But that is my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Happy to respond to this.
Go ahead.
Sure. So I can discuss you, yes, one of the association members does rent one of the moorings. How it works is there was a wait list, and she was on the wait list, and her testimony speaks to this. And she, unbeknownst when the 4 came up, she happened to be on the wait list, and so she got one of the moorings. So she directly benefits from this proposal. Nonetheless, she has concerns. This is Agnes Field. She has concerns about these moorings and is asking for their removal. So despite directly benefiting, she is asking for their removal because of the hindrances.
Thank you.
Any questions for Gordon here? Any of the members that are participating remotely? Okay, John,
No, thanks.
do you have any questions?
No, I do not.
Okay, then I think, why don't we proceed to the next witness?
Fine.
I have a quick question.
Please identify yourself.
My name is John Henry. I'm the president of the Dock Corporation. My question was, there is an abandoned granite block here that's kind of on the west side of Sergeant Head, and I was curious how you said there was never any structure or pier. I was just curious how that came into your analysis.
Well, I didn't say there was never any development. I said from 1970 that I wasn't able to see any docks or piers. I saw the granite structure, but to me, it doesn't look like a dock or a pier. I really don't know honestly what that is.
I can tell you.
Well, it's, it's not.
Yeah. If you have a question, please direct it through the chair and I'll.
So just to be clear, this is a member of the association, so I can bring this up under testimony and we can speak.
It's important that we are able to identify who is speaking and in the order that they speak. So I'm not being a stickler about this. It's for everyone's benefit.
You should be a stickler about it.
Well, I'll probably bring it up again, but
I'll be the stickler. Any other questions then for the board on here?
And so just to, with Mr. Longsworth, he has a commitment that he has to leave too, so if it's all right with you, I would open up to any questions to the public for Mr. Longsworth, since he won't be.
Sure, yeah. Any other questions from the public for Mr. Longworth?
Mr. Chair, Peter Ill, I'm on the web on Zoom. One quick question, if I might.
go ahead.
And I'm one of the flag officers of the fleet. And I wanted to thank Mr. Longworth for his comments. Quick question. You talk about docks, but did you do any evaluation of moorings in the town of Mount Desert?
No, sir, I didn't. And the real reason is that they're really difficult to see in some of the aerial photography or satellite imagery. You know, you might see some of the, say, 300 class mooring balls, or, you know, the really large ones, maybe. But I think that really wasn't what I was asked to inventory. And quite frankly, it was very difficult to do with publicly available photography. You know, you'd probably have to fly drones or get something the lower, you know, imagery taken at a lower. That would take a special effort to do a mooring inventory of the town.
Thank you, sir. Very helpful.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Mr. Chair.
Can I ask a clarifying question? But for the Cove and the images that you reviewed for the Cove, are you also not looking for moorings, or were you?
I was actually, yes. Now, you know, if we look at 1970, there could have been a mooring there that you're just not able to see in the photo. I think if there was something there, we would see it, but it's possible we may not.
So your analysis for the Cove incorporated looking for moorings?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions from the public?
You refer to this as a special code.
You identify yourself, please.
I'm sorry, Philip Kennedy, a member of the fleet. You refer to this as a special code, and you had pictures earlier. Can you identify and show us another code that was sort of, there are others, it seemed like you had showed them. Could you possibly show us another one that is somewhat similar? You had them on the map earlier, if you have any photographs. The point being, is you make it sound so unique. Maybe the others are very unique too, but it doesn't sound like this is the only one.
So to clarify, what do you mean by other? What other codes?
You had a whole picture of codes of moored codes,
Oh, undeveloped.
undeveloped codes. So I'm just wondering if you have other additional pictures showing undeveloped codes that you had identified earlier. I just wondering if you have any pictures like this.
Well, yeah, you can see them in the photography. You know, I don't know if they're within the range of this map, but I was able to look at the photos, and some of the undeveloped coves, it seemed to me, were basically mud flats and pretty low areas where it would be difficult to even get boats in. And that's why I think there are no development in those coves, because they're really not accessible. You know, they'd be places where people might clam and and things like that. Now, if I could zoom around, there are some examples I could show you. There's one off Sergeant Drive, I think up towards Abel's, the cove that comes in there, no development. And, you know, I'm just looking at the photo and the data, I don't have actual local knowledge, but I marked it as undeveloped. But it probably was a reason that it would be difficult to get any benefit by putting a pier or something in some of those areas. I did not find any other coves of the pristine nature and certainly not of the size and the magnitude of this cove, not even close.
Another question.
Go ahead.
Hi, I had a question. Were you able to review historic photographs at the public library? Because there are a number of historic photographs, and at one time there were, on the other side, certainly when there's a ledge there, they were boats weren't there, sailboats weren't there. Were you able to review going back and because there are photograph extant on the immediately?
I did. I acquired the photos from a website called historicaerials.com or something like that. And so what they had there, I looked at, you know, there's a fee for that, but I did look for that.
Specifically, did you go to the public library here and look at their collection? Because they have quite an extensive collection of photographs.
No, I did not.
Thank you.
Rick?
Yeah.
We have a question from one of the fellows on Zoom, Chara. Hey, Chara.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm sorry I came in late. I'm a resident of the town and active on the waterfront. I wonder if there's a history of any permit requests for over, going back a couple decades for any of the owners of these properties to put in docks, and whether or not what the outcome of this discussion or issue would be, whether the outcome that the town takes would have any effect on any future permits for any property owner in this cove to ask for a dock.
So I think that's a good question, but I don't think that's relevant to Mr. Longworth's testimony.
Sorry, I came in late, didn't hear the whole testimony. It's just a question.
No, I appreciate it, and frankly, I encourage you to ask it again. It's just right now, I want to be sensitive to Mr. Longsworth's time, and I don't think that's relevant to what he testified to as he spoke to his scope of search, not including past permits or anything like that.
Jim? On the question of developed coves, when we saw the map with all the red dots, you were going on piers, is that correct? But in other coves, there could be moorings in there that, would you not see them, or would you see them? Maybe not in the 1970s, but in the 20s, you could pick up moorings.
I wouldn't have confidence in an accurate survey done remotely. For the reasons that you might see some, but not all. Yeah. And the fact you can't see really anything in the old photography.
So what could look like an undeveloped cove could have moorings in it, you just can't pick them up in the satellite images.
Yes, I suppose that's true, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Follow-up question. Is that true for South Shore Cove, or did you take a closer look at South Shore Cove and have a higher degree of confidence in the presence of moorings in that cove?
I did not find any moorings. I zoomed in on all those photos and really looked as closely as I could. I wasn't able to see anything that looked like a mooring.
I have one additional follow-up question that's a response. That granite pier that was referenced over towards Sergeant Head. From your review of the photos, does it look like it's currently a pier?
It's actually visible on this.
Yeah.
To me, what it looked like was sort of a jumble of rocks or stones. I couldn't really tell if it's a natural formation or if that's something that was done by people.
Thank you.
Okay, I think the last question from the public was kind of beyond the scope of what our review, but it is a good question beyond that, but I think we'll keep moving on. Are there any other questions from the public?
One,
Ma'am,
Bonnie Rogers, I'm a member of the fleet. So when you keep talking about not being able to see, the moorings, I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning, but or what the equipment that you were using or the photographs you were using, are they qualified to see the rock on the bottom if it were a mooring, or would you actually need a diver or some other kind of equipment? Is it actually feasible to use the photograph in order to see below the water?
I would say no. Because, well, it's one of these answers where it depends how deep the water is. If it's 10 feet, yeah, you might see it. It's hard to say, there's mushrooms and blocks and every different, what really, the moorings are so different. And then in an area of 100 feet, I'd say you almost certainly would not be able to see it. Or even 50.
Chris,
I've dove that whole canoe. And prior to these moorings being set, and what I did find was there was vessels anchored, but old anchors for many years ago. Actually pulled one up, there's one up to my dad's house. But there's no mooring blocks, no chain, no mushrooms, no nothing.
when you go that last
That was early 2000s.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, seeing no other hands, I think we can free Gordon and move on to your next witness.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
So you're welcome to,
Yeah, I'll sit in the back for a while if I need to leave. Sure. Thank you all.
thank you. So Mr. Chair, my next one's gonna be Paul Sokoloff of Stantec.
Everybody signed in that needs to sign in.
Hi, Paul. Hey, could you state your name for the record and your current occupation? Yes, sure.
So I'm Paul Sokoloff, I'm a project scientist and project manager at Stantec. My background is in marine ecology, seagrass biology and seagrass ecology. I've been working on eelgrass projects and seagrass projects in general for the last 20 years.
Could you go to the PDF and the Paul Sokoloff exhibits on the bookmarks?
I just wanted to let people know that are on Zoom, questions should be submitted verbally and do not submit your questions via the chat, because we do not see those.
thank you.
Actually, I have a quick question for the chair. How many members of the committee are participating remotely?
I see two. I
Who
believe.
do you have besides Howie?
Was Donna on there?
Is Donna on?
I guess so.
Who's not here? That's a good question.
Another way to ask it.
Yeah,
Okay.
who's not here?
Donna, Reese,
Doug and Donna.
Doug. Doug, Boston,
And Donna Reese.
yes.
So we have 9 members.
There's 3 not here.
Who's the third? Doug Foster, Donna Reese, and,
I am
Oh,
here.
okay, Howie's remote.
Yeah, that's Doug remote as well.
Yeah,
Doug is-
I am here. I happen to be in Hall Quarry, so.
Doug and Howie are remote. Okay.
So do we have total on that?
We have 10 of 11 members, 8 physically here, 2
Zoom.
electronically.
Okay. All right, so yes, we go to Paul Sokoloff. Yeah, keep scrolling down. Okay, and Exhibit E, please. So Mr. Sokoloff, is this your CBD and
Yes.
accurate statement of what you just described? Okay, great. And so you have a particular background in eelgrass, is that right?
Yes, like I said, I've been working with eelgrass, and seagrasses in general. I did some work in Florida, with some tropical species for the last 20 years. I did my master's at UNH, before he retired, one of the world-renowned seagrass biologists, and the eelgrass biologist in the Northeast, Dr. Fred Short. He's now retired and does some work out in Washington on eelgrass, but
And so what did the association hire you to do?
the association hired Stantec to go out and conduct a dive survey of the cove, to determine if there was eelgrass present, as well as look at any other substrates, and map both the eelgrass and the substrates that were in the cove.
Could you give us a basic explanation of what is eelgrass?
Sure.
Why does it matter?
So eelgrass is an underwater flowering plant. It is the basis of most marine, primary production, the basis of the marine food chain. It serves as nursery habitat for both commercially and recreationally important fish and shellfish. It filters the water column, removes plankton from the water column. It removes dirt from the water column, keeps it clear. It provides coastal protection, slowing wave energy down. It sequesters carbon and fights climate change. It will reduce coastal erosion through its underground root and rhizome structure, holding sediments in place. So it's critical habitat based on EFH, essential fish habitat for, again, commercially and recreationally important fish and shellfish species.
So that would include things like lobster.
Lobsters, especially juvenile lobsters, cod, all sorts of fish and shellfish.
So is this your first time doing a dive for eelgrass in May?
No. We had several projects this year alone, 5 in the city of Portland around the Casco Bay ferry terminals. We have 2 ongoing projects working on eelgrass in both Brunswick and Harpswell. I've also done projects years ago when I was in grad school in Maine, on the Maine-New Hampshire border and the Piscataqua River, Boston Harbor. I dove up and down the East Coast looking at eelgrass, as well as in Florida, number of sites in Florida looking again at tropical species, but same general ideas of different species.
And do you have experience diving on eelgrass in the context of a moorings?
Yes, the projects I referenced in both Brunswick and then an identical project in Harpswell are projects that Stantec proposed to the MNRCP program, which is a program that takes in lieu fee funds. If a project disturbs or impacts wetlands, the proponent of that project can pay into an in lieu fee fund. The Nature Conservancy then distributes grants for wetland restoration and preservation. Stantec applied for 2 grants from that program to remove traditional block and chain moorings from eelgrass beds in Brunswick and Harpswell and replace them with conservation moorings, and then monitor the recovery of the eelgrass at those locations. So we proposed 20 moorings in Harpswell and 20 moorings in Cove.
So your background then would prepare you for evaluating the impacts on moorings, on eelgrass, and
Yes.
that sort of thing.
Yes.
Okay. And on those projects, what was the motivation there? Is it an attempt to conserve or to minimize impacts?
So yeah, it's an attempt, really to remove the impact. A traditional block and chain mooring, whether you use a granite block, a mushroom anchor, whatever the anchor is, that goes to chain to rope to the mooring ball. When the tide drops and the chain sits on the bottom, as it swings around on the bottom, it scours out the eelgrass. If it's left there long enough, it will actually scour away the sediment, creating a depression, which can fill with algae, detritus, and cause anoxic conditions. So our goal with those Brunswick and Harpswell projects were to find that balance between conservation and public use, put in moorings that will protect the eelgrass. Conservation mooring is a keel flanker that's driven into the bottom. Then there's an elastic road that goes up to the ball. That elastic road doesn't sit on the bottom. If it does slightly sit on the bottom, it will not scour out the eelgrass and it will protect the eelgrass. So we are working with the towns of Brunswick and Harpswell to attempt to do that at 20 moorings.
And Kyle, can you go to Exhibit A? So this is a depiction that we just went over with Mr. Longsworth, showing the boundaries of what the association considers to be South Fork Cove. Is this where you dove?
Yes.
Okay, and so can you kind of looking at that picture, tell us whereabouts you dove, what that process was?
Sure. So there was no historically mapped eelgrass in the cove. However, looking at Google Earth, it appeared to us that there was in fact eelgrass in the cove. In the far western portion, again, we saw what looked to be eelgrass or at least aquatic vegetation in the eastern side. So we went out in the boat and started in those areas. We have a sonar function on our depth sounder on our vessel that allows us to pick up vegetation, or at least what we think is vegetation. So we went out, we found what looked like eelgrass in the western portion. We dropped a mushroom anchor with a buoy on it, and then sent the divers down to find out if in fact what we were looking at was eelgrass. We did find that our anchor was in eelgrass. We then moved that anchor to the edge of the eelgrass bed. And then we just worked systematically around dropping a couple of anchors, sending divers down. They pulled them to the edge of the eelgrass. They swim a little bit, 20 feet, 30 feet, put another anchor down. We just keep going. We come back. Once we have enough, several anchors out, the boat comes back, GPS is the anchors, and pulls them up. And we just continue delineating the edge of the eelgrass all the way around. We did that in both the western portion, then we moved over to the eastern portion where we suspected there to be eelgrass and did the same. Once we delineated the two large beds that we found in the cove, we started to swim transects east to west to see if there was anything in the middle. What we found was that on the eastern portion of it, as you moved west, that eelgrass bed started to get into cobbly bouldery habitat as it graded up to ledge. And the western bed, as you moved eastward, the same.
Let me pause you slightly, actually. Kyle, can I direct you on the bookmarks? Sorry to interrupt you. I just think I can get a better visual while we're here. So scroll down to the Paul Socklock exhibit. Exhibit N, the Stantec report. Nope, next one. Yeah. Yep, and if you can just scroll down on this. Okay, this is where we can zoom in here. So, Paul, is this the map you prepared? And then you can,
Yes.
sorry, continue your discussion. I just think this might be helpful.
So yeah, so you can see the larger bed on the western portion. As we moved east, that graded into cobbly bouldery habitat in that small portion before you get to those hash lines, which represent a fairly sizable ledge in the middle of the cove. Then there was a smaller eelgrass bed in the eastern portion of the cove with a similar grading out to ledge through bouldery cobble habitats. While the eelgrass is delineated extremely well with buoys, again, depending on the shape of the bed, fairly well. The ledge is approximate. A hydrographic survey would need to be used to determine the exact location of the ledge, but that is the general location of the ledge. We did swim across the ledge and mark it with buoys as well. We just did not have it. We didn't get as detailed as on the ledge as we did on the eelgrass.
And if you can go to the bookmarks, Kyle. Exhibit M, the fleet proposals. So these were included in the Longsworth report, but I have printed off copies.
So these are in the record.
They're in the record in the Longsworth report. This is a higher resolution version, so it's really a demonstrative. So this depicts the 4 moorings here on your dive over to the right there. Yep. Thank you, Kyle. Are those, did you find those?
We did find those. We did dive on those. We saw the anchors. We saw the chain. Didn't witness or see a lot of scarring yet, but again, it takes, it's not an immediate put a chain in.
So were the granite blocks located in the?
They were in the eelgrass bed. At least 2. I can't remember Paul, but at least 2 was certainly in the eelgrass.
Okay. So what's the immediate impact there?
So again, once there's a boat on that mooring and the chain starts to drag on the bottom, it will not take that long for an eelgrass scar to be created. Based on our experiences on another project in Portland Harbor where we're doing a dredge project. And again, we're impacting eelgrass beds. We have to mitigate for that eelgrass bed on that dredge project. We've estimated that those moorings in Portland Harbor create 440 square feet of impact to the eelgrass bed per mooring.
440 square feet per mile.
Per mooring.
Okay. So, Kyle, can I direct you back to the bookmarks?
Can I ask what you mean by impact?
Sure, so if you think of the mooring, you have again, some sort of anchor, whether it be a mushroom anchor, or granite block, or something sitting in the middle. When that chain sits on the bottom and that boat moves with the tide, with the wind, with the currents, as that chain spins, it's heavy enough that it just digs up the eelgrass. The eelgrass is only rooted a few centimeters into the sediment. It's held, it holds well until you put some sort of stressor on it like that, and that chain will drag. And what you can see, if you look at aerial photos specifically, I know at the East End dock in Portland where they have these moorings, you can literally see from an aerial photograph an eelgrass bed and then a mooring surrounded by no eelgrass. And so the impact is eventually a complete loss of eelgrass and a mooring scar. And that happens, you see them worldwide. I mean, they happen in everywhere there's eelgrass and moorings, you wind up, unless it's a conservation mooring, you wind up with mooring scars.
So I'm gonna do two follow-up questions on that and then take us back. So follow-up questions on that. Can we go back to explain this in larger context of what is the state of eelgrass in Maine? Is it,
Sure, so eelgrass in Maine, and generally along the northeastern coast is in decline. We have several projects, I said, going on, as well as talking to others at Maine DP, UNH, Mass DMF. And generally speaking, especially this year, we've seen a large decrease in eelgrass. We did those 5 sites in Casco Bay. We saw some contraction based on what was mapped in 2018. In other parts of Casco Bay, in Falmouth and in Yarmouth, they saw even more contraction off the 2018 mapping. In Boston Harbor, they lost the entire eelgrass bed. In Boston Harbor proper, there were reductions in Great Bay, New Hampshire. So in general, eelgrass and seagrasses worldwide are in decline. Seagrasses worldwide are red listed by the UN, and generally speaking, seagrasses are in decline, and in Maine as well.
and what impact does that have on the?
Again, you lose nursery grounds, you lose feeding grounds, you lose coastal protection, creates coastal erosion, reduces the, can have an impact on climate change by not sequestering carbon. So they're a critical species in the marine habitat. So any loss of eelgrass has cascading effects on it.
Chris?
Is it designated by the state or federal government as a protected habitat?
I believe it is, yes, by both.
So Army Corps recognized it as a protected habitat and Maine DP?
Yes.
So let me do a direct follow-up on that.
Excuse me, I have a question from the audience.
Well, can we let's let
Yeah.
him finish? his
All right,
line?
I'm sorry.
Okay. So first question for you here, we've talked about the effects of the bottom chain, right?
Yes.
So you talked about how it can dislodge the root system of the eelgrass. So is that a permanent effect? Can it recover?
Again, eelgrass restoration projects often fail because you don't remove the stressor that caused the loss of the eelgrass. So if you don't remove the bottom chain, if you attempt to put eelgrass there again, you're just gonna have the same loss. The other impact that you can have is as you begin to scour out that bottom, you can create a sink for macroalgae and other things floating around. As those things die, you create anoxia. You can then cause sulfide to get into any eelgrass roots that take place there, and then the sulfide poisons the eelgrass. So without removing the bottom chain, no, the eelgrass can't recover. That is the basis of our Brunswick and Hartsville projects, okay? There's been an impact at these 20 moorings. We're gonna change that mooring to one that doesn't impact eelgrass, and we're gonna watch. Ideally, the plan was to watch for natural recovery. In both Brunswick and Hartsville, we found, Cove on 40 moorings, we found 2 very, very small patches of eelgrass. So projects are a little bit in limbo because the eelgrass is not anywhere at the sites.
Right. Kyle, could you go to the exhibit be.
Yeah, I do. Go ahead, please.
Peter Rogers, Northeast Harbor, member of the fleet. I have a two-part question for you. The first part is, did you formulate a rough or detailed measurement for what we could call the western eelgrass bed in terms of square area? And of that, for the two moorings where you claim there was a problem with eelgrass, can you quantify that as a percentage of that total?
So the western bed is roughly 208,500 square feet. Again, we didn't estimate those scars. We were more delineating the whole bed, but based on it would be about a 900 square foot impact from those two moorings in particular in the eelgrass.
And as a percentage, that would be
I mean, it'd be a very small percent.
how small?
900 square feet out of 208,000, so,
Thank you.
Well, you've, I have a question. You've indicated that each mooring would have an effect of 440 square feet. Out of the four potential moorings, that's 1,760 square feet. And you said there was 208,000 square feet of area. I could divide that by 44,000 and come up for acreage. Have you done the acreage?
I have not.
I have. We're talking about an area that's 29 acres. And you're talking about an impact on 1,760 square feet. Okay.
So, sorry, can I ask briefly here? So I think, as I understood the original procedural order, we would go through a sort of direct examination, then open it up to the committee. And then the, we and the public. And I asked just because it's a little bit disjointed, and so it's hard to, I think it would be a more easily understood presentation if we kept a little bit of structure on that. I recognize that your call as the chair, but that would be my suggestion.
I like your suggestion, but I also like the idea of asking questions when the issue is brought up so that it's clear in everyone's mind.
Maybe we split the difference and have the harbor committee ask questions, and then we wait for the public at the end of each expert. That's a question.
Sure.
I have a question. What happens if we move away from the eelgrass? What's the problem there?
If you move away from the eelgrass, again, in the center of the cove, there's a large ledge. Ledge is designated by NOAA and National Marine Fishery Service as complex habitat. Again, it supports commercially and recreationally important fish and shellfish species, specifically the early settlement of lobsters. They want to go into the kelp, and so the kelp is growing on that ledge. And further, you really can't put moorings on ledge. The way that a traditional mooring works is that mooring anchor, whether again it be a granite block or a mushroom anchor, it sinks into the sediment slightly, and that's how you get your holding power. If you put it on the ledge, there's nothing for it to really sit in. It's just sitting on rock. It's just eventually going to drag across the rock, destroy the kelp habitat, and it's not going to stay in the same place. It's going to be potentially a safety issue. If you try to conservation mooring, I don't install conservation moorings. We are working with a conservation mooring installer. I don't know if they can be installed into the
So can I step you back on that? Can you explain what a conservation mooring is?
So yeah, conservation mooring again is that helical anchor that's driven into the bottom that then has an elastic road going to the surface. I don't believe they can be installed in ledge, but I'm not a mooring installer, so I don't know for sure.
Is the conservation mooring permitted for protected habitat by the state and federal government?
Yes.
Can you just define what ledge is?
So we defined ledge as hard substrate. So bedrock, cobble, boulders, anything bigger than a cobble, basically we called ledge, because while we did swim across that center ledge and certainly delineated the ledge in the western and eastern portions, it's hard to say where it was bedrock versus cobble versus boulder. We didn't delineate to that extent, but anything that was larger than cobbles, we called ledge. There is certainly some gravel, some sandy substrates, gravelly, sandy and shell hash in and around the eelgrass beds, but that wasn't considered ledge. It had to be cobbles or larger.
So if I can summarize that, would you say that it's eelgrass beds and ledge from the environmental perspective are not suitable locations for moorings?
Yes, they're not ideal locations for moorings. From an ecological perspective, certainly both of them, and then from a feasibility, again, ledge is not an ideal place to put a mooring.
And so what about the boat activity that's associated with the moorings? Can you
Yes.
speak to the impacts there?
So this wasn't necessarily something that we studied specifically, but generally speaking, when you have increased boating activity in eelgrass or seagrass beds in general, outboard engines, if they come in contact with the eelgrass, create prop scars, which essentially is, instead of it being, circular or oval shape, the scar you get from a mooring, you wind up with just a line where the prop scar went, where the prop went. You can also get it from a sailboat with a centerboard. If it contacts the bottom again, it can create a scar in that eelgrass.
And so did you consider the depths of the cove and where those moorings were located?
We did. I mean, we didn't have specific locations of the moorings, but that eelgrass bed, on the inner portion, we were only in, 7 to 8 feet of water, out to probably the deepest portions of that eelgrass bed, at least on the western side, we're in roughly 20 feet. The eastern bed was much shallower. I would say at its shallowest was 3 or 4 feet all the way up against where that ledge is, but.
So with the permits permitting up to a 30-foot vessel, do you think it's foreseeable that you could have that sort of negative impact of boating activity on what these
Yeah.
moorings?
It is. It's always possible when you have seagrasses and eelgrass and boats. There's always the possibility of a prop scar or a sailboat.
And so a conservation mooring would mitigate the impacts of the bottom chain effect, but it wouldn't mitigate the impacts of the boating activity.
Correct.
Okay. And in terms of conservation moorings, could the committee just be like, okay, we're gonna solve this conservation mooring on those four that are in or near the eelgrass habitat? Is that something you can go ahead and do, or there's steps that have to happen in between?
Again, not being a mooring installer, you need to know the sediment type, the depth, size of the boat, all those pieces of information. But yes, most likely you could put conservation moorings in, assuming that the substrate there is suitable for a conservation mooring.
Right.
And I've been dealing with a mooring installer, but that is not.
Right. Your report talked about a particular study that you would recommend before.
So again, that's looking at a hydrographic survey to look at where the ledge is and to see what your bottom type is. We observe the surface, but we don't know what's below that sediment, right? I mean, it's obviously the bedrock is exposed in several places in the cove, so we don't know how shallow it is to bedrock in other parts of the cove.
Kyle, could you direct me to exhibit B, and then I'll certainly allow that. question. You can just start to go to exhibit B of the policy.
Did you observe any lobster traps in that area at the time when you dove?
No.
Do lobster traps, would they be a danger to eelgrass?
They could smother eelgrass, I guess. I've not seen in my experience a lot of lobster traps directly in the eelgrass. Primarily, the lobsters that use eelgrass would not be of interest to a lobsterman. They're more on the juvenile side, so they're not going to put a trap there to catch juvenile lobsters. They're not of legal size. We did see several lobsters on the dive, but we didn't witness any. We didn't observe any traps.
I am a retired lobsterman and I have fished eelgrass. There are lobsters there, and you come up with eelgrass on your traps.
Okay.
And I guess, should this association ask to ban lobster traps from there?
Well,
It's one of the things that is going on.
so I've not seen that. Where I dove, the lobster traps again were outside the eelgrass. But are you seeing, when you were doing this, were you seeing plants, like whole plants with roots, or were you seeing leaves? Because eelgrass is what's called a leaf replacing species, and so the new leaf comes up the middle and it drops a leaf. So when you drive around in a boat, you see lots of eelgrass leaves, but that's just part of its biology and its phenology and how it grows. So If it's not the entire plant coming up, then the trap may not be having any effect on it. It's just one more thing on the bottom that catches, leaves, just like, I mean, a dock will catch it. I mean, I used to spend hours in grad school just collecting the plants that had floated by that washed up on the dock, so.
So is it fair to say that the impact caused by a mooring, a standard mooring to be in the grass bed, is of a different degree and magnitude and intensity entirely from the impact from the lobster trap?
Yes.
Could you scroll down, Kyle, in this report? I just think there are some photos here from your dive. Sorry, so if you go to, well, actually, if you just go into that page in the PDF, yeah, and just scroll down. So that's good. So Paul, so this is an example of the eelgrass that you found in South.
So this is the eelgrass that we found in the South Shore. You can see it's doing fairly well. It wasn't the sunniest day, so we didn't have the greatest light down there. Some of these photos are a little dark, but it is a fairly robust bed compared to a lot of what we were seeing in other places in Maine this summer. And then there's one on this one, you can see the substrate in the area with the gravelly sands and some shell hash. And so again, to your question earlier about what's ledge, that's just, those would be more of a gravel substrate. We wouldn't have classified that as ledge. Sure. And then this is gravelly sand and shells. It's starting to get into some cobbles. There is a lobster in the eelgrass. It's a little hard to see it on there, but there is a lobster in there.
Anyone else need to sign in?
And so you
It gets up on the,
and Paul, so did you review as well the larger proposal from the fleet that went down, the 30+ moorings there? And so the impact on that would be far more significant than what we're talking on these four here, right?
and there's an example of ledge habitat. You can see the green is kelp, and then there was a sea star.
And what are the impacts on moorings on ledge habitat?
Again, they'd be similar to what's on eelgrass. If the mooring anchor stayed in place, the chain would scour the kelp and dislodge any organisms living on it. Again, kelp is critical habitat for juvenile lobsters. Or the anchor could simply slide across the ledge, having nothing to actually kind of sink into and grip and scour what kelp is on the ledge.
So looking back to your experience working with other communities, what would you say are the ideal or the best practices if you're planning a mooring field and you want to account for conservation?
So yeah, so in both Brunswick and Harpswell, as a part of our projects to replace existing moorings with conservation moorings, both towns are currently in the process of, or have done, I believe in Harpswell, change their ordinances that any new moorings proposed in the Eelgrass Bay are going to be required to be conservation moorings. They were going to take a step to just ban moorings in Eelgrass and Harpswell, and they changed their mind and said, okay, we'll let moorings in Eelgrass, but it has to be a conservation mooring. They will not allow any more traditional block and chain moorings in Eelgrass Bay.
And so is one of the reasons that the towns have to put in regulations like that and have to consider that? Is it because you wouldn't necessarily always have state or federal permitting triggered for eelgrass?
Yes, most towns, I believe in Maine, the moorings are at the municipal level, and so there's no, the town says you can put the mooring in, then you put the mooring in, so they're passing these ordinances in their town to make sure that they preserve the eelgrass.
So have you worked with other harbor committees?
Not specifically with harbor committees. In both Harpswell and Brunswick, we're working with the harbor masters, and in Brunswick as well. They have a harbor master and a coastal marine resources office. Those are.
So is it fair to say that the responsibility then for considering the impacts on the eelgrass when installing moorings falls on the harbor master, the harbor committee, or the
Yes.
entity?
Yes, we've been working directly with the harbor masters, but the harbor masters had to take it to the town council, the marine resources committee in Brunswick, and I don't know if the committee is exactly in Harpswell, but yes, they had to go before the appropriate town committee.
So the decision here to place the moorings was that in the written decision discusses there were no safety concerns and there was no interference with use. in your opinion, based on working with these communities and best practices, would best practice involve first studying this area to confirm the scope of these sites and then determine what impacts would be minimal and what other perhaps alternative areas? What would you describe as the best practice in a situation like this?
Yeah, I think the road you're going down, mapping the eelgrass, determining if there's an appropriate location outside of the eelgrass, and if not, determining what the best practices would be. My opinion, it's either, it's certainly not traditional, it would be conservation moorings if you're going to put them in eelgrass.
Now, of course, the harbor master didn't have your report
Yes.
when you did this, right? So similarly, though, you probably consulted which was mentioned on a previous comment, the DEP mapping of eelgrass.
Yes, so DEP and DMR map eelgrass. They, like all state agencies, have limited funds, so I believe this area has not been mapped since 2010. There's more recent mapping in Casco Bay, it was done in 2013, 2018. They are currently making new maps for Casco Bay. But eelgrass is dynamic, it does shrink and contract, so it's certainly possible those 2010 maps didn't show any eelgrass, it could have been there. They could have missed it, again, if they didn't have the money to come out and ground truth, especially if they didn't find anything, they might not have prioritized it as a site to dive on. But we went out and dove on the site and certainly found these 2 eelgrass beds.
And in comparison to what you found elsewhere.
These are great, I mean, they were, like I said, we dove on 5 sites in Casco Bay, Boston Harbor, Sears Island this summer, and this is Brunswick, Hartswell. This was certainly the nicest of all the eelgrass beds and the most productive from an ecological standpoint.
And are you familiar with the general permit process for the Army Corps of Engineers? Okay. And are you familiar with the general permit, in this case, the self-verification permit is what's required for moorings that require permits? Okay. And so generally on that kind of level, you wouldn't get into this wouldn't be relevant, right? But are you aware of a process whereby you can request reconsideration of a permit under the Army Corps? Okay. So I have for the record. In our filing, separate copy, will not go into this in depth, I'll just submit it for the record to support the assertions I just made.
So this is already in the filing.
This is in what was filed today. Uploaded to share. So all this is just repeating what you discussed. There's a general permit required, moorings, or what's called the self-verification. However, one of the grounds one of the grounds for reconsideration of a mooring is new circumstances. So if you look at section 32,
That's right.
it references 33 CFR 325. So I'm sorry, I'm on page 15. Get that back. Okay, and then Kyle, can I, so, yeah, right there, so on 15, it talks about modification, suspension and revocation. And it makes a reference to 33 CFR. That's 325. Can you scroll down, Kyle? Actually, multiple pages, scroll down. Okay, right there, yep, no, show that. So this is the reference that's made there, the standard for reconsidering or revoking a Army Corps permit. And the second highlight there is among the factors to be considered are the extent of the permittee's compliance with the terms and conditions of the permit, whether or not circumstances related to the authorized activity have changed since the permit was issued or extended. So my question to you is, is the discovery of eelgrass that previously was not known based on resources that were available to the permitting authority here? Is that discovery, in your opinion, a change in circumstances that would give grounds for reconsideration of an Army Corps permit?
Yes.
have a question up.
Well,
Yeah,
is he done? I think we should wait.
Yep, let me,
we'll wait until he's done with his presentation.
so I guess my final questions for you, based on your report, are these four moorings interfering with the existing use of the harbor as a habitat for eelgrass and activities that depend on that, including lobster and recreation?
Yes, at those locations, the bottom chain will scour the eelgrass, that habitat.
So the ordinance talks about the best interest of the town, so with that in mind, is there anything that would be in the best interest of the town to either ideally avoid completely or at least mitigate these effects through conservation moorings or relocating?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Questions?
Tom, go ahead, Tom.
Going back to this latest map that we have here. If we move those moorings from the eelgrass out between the ledges, what would be the problem? And I understand the holding, so I have had a couple of holes, but
I mean, based on what we found, assuming that you move them out and you model the swing of the chain.
right,
Then there's really no issue in those other areas.
good, thank you.
So exhibit K, Kyle, is that the plan thing? A little bit down, yeah, right there.
See.
So essentially what you're referring to would be outside of those eelgrass and outside of the
Right.
ledge.
It's just a question.
Yeah, I was just trying to give it.
I have a question about eelgrass. Is this a permanent growth on the bottom, or does it come over a period of decades and disappear on its own? Or, I'm not talking about human influence.
So without human influence, it doesn't disappear. I would say that it's dynamic. Based on just natural conditions alone, it will expand and contract based on water clarity and water quality. So for instance, in Boston Harbor 2 years ago, and in the South Shore of Massachusetts, where we were doing a lot of work at that time, the eelgrass was doing great. I mean, we had 3 and 4 foot long plants. I mean, they were huge. Just, we had a drought, it didn't rain, so there was no turbidity, and the grass did great, lots of sunlight. The next summer, we suspect that, we know it rained. We had 3 months of near record rainfall to get a lot of turbidity, and we lose that eelgrass. And that's just natural expansion and contraction. So without human impact, I don't think it would completely disappear. I think you would just have some expansion and contraction of it. It also will move as the eelgrass grows and it puts out a new piece of rhizome, the actual above ground structures shift, but it often then puts out a new above ground structure. So it does have some dynamics to it, but it doesn't naturally necessarily just disappear completely.
And in back, I'm gonna ask, go ahead.
I would say I'm a member of the fleet, but I'm also a member of the public who uses transits at Cove all the time. I'm wondering 2 things. The main thing is there any activity that you would recommend that would not harm eelgrass? Is there anything we humans can do? Anchor deep diving to look for eelgrass? Is there anything, and lobstering, I would assume is not great, but anything that would be perfect human activity?
Of course not. But that's the challenge in any project that you have development. It's not that we, as somebody who's passionate about the eelgrass, I understand that you can't just eliminate human activity, but there is a way to find a balance, such as conservation moorings, or saying, okay, we know this cove has this large eelgrass bed, try to avoid the anchorage in that area. But there's nothing perfect, but there is a balance between, just like anywhere else, right?
And in that, I gather we're only considering 4 moorings. Is there possibly a significant impact? I mean, that's why I think why we're here.
Right, again, no, the impact from a square footage perspective is fairly small compared to the rest of the eelgrass bed, but.
Thank you.
Question?
Yeah, hi, my name is Gordon Beck. I'm a member of the fleet. I also co-chair the green team for the fleet.
Two questions. One, to go back to your comments on boat activity. If I recall, you said that western eelgrass bed in roughly 20 feet of water.
The deep edge is in 20 feet of water. The shallow side of it was 4 to 5 feet.
But the four moorings are in the deeper side of that, which would, in my mind, mean very little effect from boat activity. Certainly outboard props.
Assuming that nobody's going further into the,
Moorings would not be put in shallow enough area there, so that doesn't seem to be a major issue. Second, in your Harpswell project.
Yes.
Is it safe to say that they're going to conservation moorings specifically because they can offer restoration possibilities for those eelgrass beds that have been damaged by traditional?
yes, so we proposed that project as a way to restore the eelgrass in those locations because of previous damage from moorings, yes. It was-
And to do that, you use conservation moorings with much smaller footprint on the
The-
seabed floor.
The conservation mooring has no impact on the eelgrass.
Thank you.
The impact of the seafloor is fair, yes, is minimal. There is still an impact, yes, getting back to your question, but it's, again, depending on the size of the helical anchor, fairly small, but yes, that's. The purpose of those is to preserve seagrass and eelgrass, by putting in those moorings so you don't scour the bottom.
And is it fair to say that Harpswell is basing their selection process on studies that have been done in a number of other anchorages, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Florida,
Yes,
on and on?
yes,
So the technology is proven
yes,
to prevent eelgrass damage.
yes.
Thank you.
Board have any questions?
Yeah, so kind of the number I asked a question before. Did you do any tests on the other side of your Patrick's slide?
No, what you're seeing was our study area.
Would you be surprised to find eelgrass on the other side?
Without knowing anything about the other side, I can't say, but I wouldn't be surprised if the water depths and the physical conditions of that area are the same, then no, I wouldn't be surprised.
So in 100 years of having moorings there, and there's still eelgrass there, would that surprise you?
I'm sorry, objection. There is, you just inserted the fact that there being eelgrass there.
So my point is that the fleet's been there for 100 years, and there's been moorings there. So the fact is that we've had non-conservation moorings in there, and if there's still eelgrass, it sounds like maybe maybe that four moorings on the other side really would.
Yes, and the objection I had was you're inserting a fact that there being eelgrass in Patrick's Cove, and that hasn't been established in the record.
So you don't know if there is or not, but you wouldn't be surprised if there was.
Surrounding the moorings themselves, I'd be very surprised if they'd been there for that long, if there was any eelgrass surrounding the actual individual moorings.
But I'm just on the other side of the ledge.
If on the other side of the ledge, you have the appropriate substrate, the appropriate water depths, outside of the areas that would be scoured by the moorings, no, I would not be surprised if there's eelgrass, but directly around those moorings, I would be extremely surprised if not only was that there was eelgrass, but that you didn't actually see a significant depression in the bottom and a collection of detritus from all that time. Eventually, the mooring change will not only remove the eelgrass, it will remove up to 6 to 8 inches of sediment and create a depression in an noxious environment.
Now, have we put new moorings, as you described, that would help, right?
If you put in conservation moorings, yes, they eliminate that impact to the
Thank
bottom.
you.
Chris?
So you referenced this modification for the Army Corps. Are you briefed in that? And are you, if there was moorings in eelgrass and they are damaging the eelgrass, have you seen the permits revoked?
I have not, no.
John Moyne, Harbor Master. Is there an acceptable level of moorings in eelgrass?
Again, I think that's on a sort of town by town basis.
So there's nothing from the state.
Not that I'm aware of from the state. I know working with Angie Brewer at DEP, who's the DEP eelgrass biologist on the Brunswick and Hartsville projects, she would like to see no moorings in eelgrass, but I don't think that that's in state regulations. Again, in the towns of Brunswick and Hartsville, they are moving forward towards removing, not allowing further moorings in eelgrass. They still have some existing beyond the 20 that we're looking at, but moving forward there, at least on it.
And that's no moorings regardless of whether they're conservation moorings or. regular.
They will know, they will allow conservation moorings in eelgrass, but no new block and chain moorings will be allowed.
That would be a condition of.
Of getting a new mooring. If you apply for a new mooring in Brunswick or Hartswell, again, I'm not sure where exactly the towns are, if they're changing their ordinances, but moving forward, their goal is to not allow any traditional block and chain moorings in the eelgrass bed.
Here, another question. Did you take depth soundings on the 4 moorings?
I did not, no.
Well, I happen to have them because they're in the folders that you provided with the things. The mean level water is 10 feet on all 4 of those moorings. That's the mean level water. It could be a foot lower at a extreme tide, but do you think that's a sufficient depth that it would keep boats from the propellers and keels from touching?
I'm less versed in sailboats, but certainly at 10 feet, it would seem extremely unlikely that the propeller would hit the bottom.
And anybody that happened to go in the cove further, you know, that would be on their own. Anybody could do that with
Sure.
any boat, anytime.
Absolutely.
Nothing to do with the full line. Right?
Yeah.
Any other questions from committee members?
Oh, I have one other question. Moorings themselves provide habitat. I'm a diver. I've dove on hundreds of moorings. Every mooring I dive on is covered in life. What do you got from?
Sure,
your
but the
perspective
life
on
that's usually on mooring are things like tunicates, epiphytic algae. They don't serve the same ecosystem services.
Kelp and stuff? I mean, the moorings out here in the harbors and in most everywhere I dive are covered in kelp. And I even dove on one of the University of Maine's moorings that has all the holes in it that were made for a habitat, that's called a habitat mooring. I find tons of life in those. I'm just wondering if that can outweigh the scar that might be put in.
Again, I think that
by a mooring chain.
the eelgrass provides a different set of ecosystem services that the kelp and some of the other life on a mooring don't. While those are helpful, it's not.
Any more questions, John?
We have another hand here.
Could I ask a question? A member of the public, Margot Bass?
I'm gonna ask you to hold because I recognize somebody prior.
1 second, Mark. Is there a sort of a list of when seagrass disappears that you found that these are generally the major effects that have caused the eelgrass to die? Is it carbon dioxide? Is it sun? Is it, lack of oxygen in the water? Is it algae? Where did the mooring fit on that list?
I would say there are times where you have a die off of eelgrass that you don't find out the cause, but there are other times where you specifically know. For instance, Salem Harbor in Massachusetts, you can visibly see the mooring scars if you look at an aerial photograph. We know that there's this large eelgrass bed and then there are these individual scars surrounding these moorings. In other places where you lose the eelgrass bed, maybe there aren't moorings. So no, we don't know that it's from a mooring. It could be from any number of things. But when they're in mooring keel, you can look at an aerial photograph and see the scars.
You want to carry on further?
I have no further questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
There was a question.
There was a question, yeah.
Margot?
Yes, thank you. Paul, how would you describe the water quality in the Cove and the robustness and height of this western eelgrass meadow where we can see the 4 red dot circle moorings were placed?
Yeah, so the water clarity was great. We had, again, on a cloudy day, 5 to 6 feet of visibility. And the plants were 3 to 4 feet tall. By that time of year, it's mostly just vegetative shoots. There weren't a lot of reproductive shoots. We did see the occasional reproductive shoot in there, but again, it was in the interior of that bed, it was dense. 70% cover of eelgrass at the bottom. On the edges, it's a little bit more sparse, which isn't surprising. The deep edge more sparse than the shallower edges. But it was a very robust, healthy looking eelgrass bed.
Thank you.
Rick, this is Howie.
Yes.
I, hi, I just wanted to let you know that Don is now on the line, so so we have a full committee.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the public?
Fine, I just saw me before. I just think that Don made a good point. He was talking about how he dives on all of these mushrooms and have, there's also some that are sort of created to have the habitat. When you answered that question, I wasn't clear on, is like eelgrass is so much, more important than all the kelp and all the things that are growing on the mushroom? Are we weighing that there's some of this wildlife that's so much more important that it's about balancing the other one?
Yeah, there have been numerous studies that do try to put an economic value on habitats like that and look at the benefits of a given habitat versus another and try to say, okay, these are the ecosystem goods and services provided by eelgrass versus provided by kelp or salt marsh and compare them. So yes, I think there are a number of ecosystem goods and services provided by eelgrass that those kelps and some of those other habitats don't necessarily provide.
I have a question here.
I have a quick question. My name is Hillary Kennedy, fleet member. There's one boat on these 4 moorings, right? There's one boat currently moored on these 4 moorings, and that boat that is moored belongs to somebody who lives in this cove, right? We established that, yes? Is that mooring in the eelgrass, or is that mooring not in the eelgrass that's currently being used?
It's one of those 4 red dots.
Right.
It's in the, all 4 of those are in the eelgrass.
Oh, the way I guess I didn't understand. The way I see it is that they're not all 4 in the eelgrass.
That dotted line represents the
So the boat that's currently there, that's owned by someone who lives in this cove,
Yes,
is actually moored in eelgrass.
yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Sir?
I'm Jamie Blaine. I live at 4 Southwood Lane, and just a point of fact, the boat that is on the mooring does not belong to somebody who lives in Central Cove.
One quick question. I thought early in your thing, you said that only 2 of the 4 moorings were actually in the eelgrass.
That's all.
You did speak to that.
I think you were saying it based on your physical.
We
inspection.
only saw, we only physically observed 2 of them more. But 4, we didn't, with limited time and tide, we did not swim the entirety of the eelgrass bed, so we did not see the 2 that are on the interior. We did swim across that outer portion and did actually see those 2 moorings that are there. But we did see all 4 of the moorings all there.
Okay. I'm gonna call for a recess.
Sorry, I had a quick question.
What?
Hello? I'm on Zoom. It's Mimi Hansen. And I'm do you have time to have a question?
You said a quick question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about, it was asked a little bit earlier. I'm a mom of fleet children, kids who sail there, and a launch driver for the fleet. And I just had a question about other views of eelgrass, particularly on the coast or the Gulf of Maine. And I didn't know if you're familiar with someone called Bob Stenek, who's a professor at the University of Maine. Can you share with, sorry, well, thank you. Can you share with us a little bit of his view of eelgrass and how it may be different on the Gulf of Maine than other areas that you were describing? And I can share some stuff with the group if.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's like I said, I was an intern for Bob years ago. I don't, but can't speak to his views on eelgrass. When I worked for Bob, he was primarily focused on lobsters. At that time, there was still an active urchin fishery in, the Portland and southern Maine area that he was looking at, as well as coral and algae. So I can't speak to Bob's opinion on eelgrass in the Gulf of Maine.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. One thing that I saw just knowing a little bit about, I'm interested in grasses in general.
Ma'am, this is testimony. You'll have an opportunity as a member of the public.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you.
I think we've exhausted the.
I'm going to go ahead with our recess and I'll call us back in 5 minutes.
Yeah, so we're done with Mr. Sunquist. Thank you. So. Let me get it, I'll do it home.
Did you get rain? Rain?
Thank you. Yeah. No way.
No, they really.
Yeah, but they only wanted down 45 minutes. No. I don't think the other.
Let's meeting.
Yeah.
Sounded like it was.
I need someone else to take some shot.
I mean, but I feel like here, I feel like.
Margaret against the
Okay, folks, I'm gonna call the meeting back to order.
Yeah. No, I just, no, okay.
So I'll resume by asking Tracy and David, and it's all right if they're right there, if we can all hear them from this location. Tracy and David, yeah, okay, good. So can you introduce yourselves?
Yeah.
To the board?
My name is David Garrett. I'm a longtime summer resident. And this is my fiance Tracy.
Tracy Montre, summer resident, but although we did spend a full year during the pandemic.
Okay.
And your property is where?
We're in 3 Southwind Lane. We're neighbors of Jimmy Blaine's. So right on the water there. We've had the property in the family for 100 years. 5 generations have lived there. I went to the fleet and learned how to sail, so did my brothers. My great grandfather was a founding member of the fleet. We value the fleet. Yeah, so.
Yeah, sure. So based on your time on the Cove, you testified in your written testimony, you spoke about wildlife. Can you just describe what you observed?
Yes, we've observed regularly seals out hunting out in that cove for extended periods, and harbor porpoises. And you get up early enough in the morning, you see all kinds of activity out there. And we are very concerned about the impact of just more human activity out in that cove. It's hard to imagine the seals continuing to hunt out there and do whatever else in that habitat, having to navigate moorings out there.
Have you seen less wildlife activity since these 4 moorings?
Yes, prior to the moorings, you would see the seals hunt along the entire expanse of the cove versus now when, from our vantage point, they have moved far to the left and have a more limited scope of hunting.
Okay. So moving on to the Cove has been described in written materials from other members of the committee as a wild and undeveloped cove. The fleet's materials, they describe it as particularly protected and characterized as an extension of the Cove. Would you agree with either of those characterizations of the cove based on your personal experience?
I would agree with it as a wild area. The lobstermen do work there, and obviously there's pleasure boating out there and whatnot, but for the most part, I would consider it a wild area.
And so I'm going to represent to you that under Maine law, a property owner can give relevant and credible testimony on the impact that development can have on the property, either positively or negatively. So with that in mind, in your opinion, does this development interfere with your use and enjoyment of your property such that it would reduce your property value?
I believe it would reduce the property value. As I say, as I said, the moorings will attract more human activity out there, and so, yes, I think absolutely it would change the character of the cove. It would change the nature of it.
Previously, when we were under Gordon Longsworth testimony, we talked about granite piling, and you said you had some personal information about that, perhaps some of the history of what that is.
Yes, it's my understanding that that was a remnant of a coal dock. My mother remembers coal docks out there. And that once the need for coal for heating was gone, so were the docks. They got rid of them pretty much immediately. My mother couldn't be here today, but she also remembered, I think it was 10 years ago, someone had proposed putting a dock out there, and she was very vocal in this room back then about not laying a dock out. And she recalled again the docks that the granite pilings were used for. But she spoke to this in her note to the committee about how much the area thrived once those docks were gone.
And so based on your experience living in the Cove, do you get hard storms? Would you agree with the characterization that it's well protected?
I would not call it well protected from storms. We do get some protection from the islands out there. We're not, but there's a great big open course out to the sea, and we will get hard hit when storms come in. We have lost trees to erosion, and to those storms, we're on constant vigilance on trees on our property because they will come down with the winds.
So last question, you talked about you learned to sail with the fleet, you were conduit. So, despite supporting the fleets and a lot of this work, you oppose this. Why is that?
It feels akin to me like the Acadia putting a cap on the number of visitors up to Cadillac Mountain rather than, say, building a parking deck at the summit, or to the decision 45 years ago that Maine made to outlaw billboards. It's just an assertion of the commitment to achieving a balance between economic development and the wild beauty that's inherent to our state. And that's what is most important to us and to the association.
Thank you. Well, I have no further questions for you, so I don't know if the committee does.
Just to clarify, they're members of the South Shore. Cove.
They are.
Thank you very much.
Okay. If it's moving, Margot Bass, are you still on? Maybe you're muted.
Stephen,
Yes, I'm here. Can you
Yes,
hear
so
me?
feedback will come after these members, if that's all right.
Can you hear me?
I'm gonna remind you that I gave you 2 hours.
Okay, so I'm happy to address that. So that 2 hours, my understanding was pertaining to my witnesses' testimony. So that didn't anticipate public comments and committee comments. So I think I'm gonna go as fast as I can, but we're probably gonna go slightly over that 2 hours, given that we're integrating public comment and committee.
There'll be a decision I'll make, but
Understood. I'm telling you the directions that I got at the beginning and how we.
I hope you understand how we feel too.
I absolutely do. We'll move as fast as I can. Margaret, can you just state your name for the record, please?
Yes, I'm Margot Bass.
Getting a bad connection.
Okay. I'm gonna
Turn it
move.
off. Yeah.
Your camera.
Stephen?
Michael.
Stephen,
Yeah.
can you hear me better if I just take
Yeah,
off?
I can
the-
hear you better. We're getting clearly
Okay.
now.
Okay.
So Margaret, your testimony, I'm just gonna touch, because you gave extensive written testimony, so I'm just gonna touch on a few quick points here. You expressed concerns about safety based on what you have witnessed. over the years? Can you describe what you have personal experience of that gives you concerns about safety here?
Yes, so I have 4 concerns about the safety of these moorings. My first concern is that this harbor is not a safe haven. It's an open mouth cove. It's not an encompassed, protected cove like the Northeast Harbor Marina or Gilpatrick Cove that curls around. And it is exposed directly to the western way from where storms can come. And I've seen huge logs cast up onto our beach after storms. And hurricane season has become an increasing concern for me on this cove. And I've actually been talking to a contractor about getting hurricane shutters, particularly for the south side of the house, which gets battered when there are storms. So my first concern is it's not a good, safe place in view of the storms that hit this cove. My second concern is that there are no sight lines from either the Fleet or the Clifton dock into this cove. So they're both.
So Margo, I'm trying to cut you off a little bit because we are limited on time here. So were there any observations you've made of the Fleet recently, that on that cove that support these concerns?
Well, the last time I was there were multiple boats on the moorings, for example, and people are saying there are no boats on their moorings except for Agnes's boat, which is not there. So I think that can show you that the Fleet doesn't know exactly what's going on with those moorings in terms of visual sight lines, because you can't see directly from the Fleet pier this cove.
Okay, and Margaret, you have a bit of a background in conservation, so I'm just going to ask you very, very, very briefly, why is that discovery of the eelgrass so significant and valuable to you as someone with a conservation background and as someone with property on South Shore Cove?
Well, I think it's a really important discovery that there's a protected critical habitat in this cove, and there's not just one of them. There are 2 eelgrass meadows in this cove. And as Paul described, they're very robust. These are really important because they're critical nurseries and habitat for commercially and recreationally important shellfish and fish species, including for being nurseries for lobsters. The eelgrass erosion, and they also the eelgrass meadows passively filter the water, so they maintain really high water quality for all marine. Very important finding, and it's something the harbor master did not know making the decision, as it was discovered over the summer. So I think it should give the committee pause and to consider what sort of development, if any, is it going to allow in eelgrass meadows in the town of Mount Desert? Because as Paul said, it's a habitat that's disappearing and has disappeared entirely from harbors like Boston Harbor.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate that perspective, Margaret. So I have no further questions for you. And again, I just reflective of the time that we have here, and I refer the committee to your written testimony, which was extensive on these points. I turn it over to the chair.
Stephen, could I just make one more point? Stephen, could I make one more point?
Unless it's a factual question, no. If it's in your written testimony.
Well, it's a fact.
Margaret, we're gonna move on.
Okay.
Any questions from the harbor committee?
Okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. No, okay, so moving on. Jamie Blaine, I just have a couple of quick questions for you. Right here. Okay. This is exhibit P. This is a letter from Lobsterman that was submitted and it's made part of the reference in our brief and incorporated by reference, but these are copies of that letter. This was presented to the committee previously. Jamie, can you just state your name for the record and where your property is? Jamie Blaine, Blaine. Okay, and I am Cove Association. Thank you. Are you familiar with this letter that's being circulated? Okay, can you explain?
After the first meeting, our desire to protect the cove for a lot in the condition that it has been in for decades, includes the lobster habitat and lobster that goes on there. So it occurred to me that some lobstermen might think this was not a good idea that the fleet had proposed. So I asked Mike Kelly, and he said he had talked to lobstermen who thought that this was not a good idea. So he wrote to send a letter to the harbor committee, and he said yes. I helped write the letter, and Mike went out and got the signature.
And when you wrote that letter, you understood in your conversations, was it understood that we were at present dealing with 4 moorings and there was potential for more moorings?
Well, this was in reaction to the big plan. And so from my perspective, keeping the cove pristine is critical. And I know we can't talk about the police bigger plan, but it's hard to believe we're here for just 4 moorings.
Okay. Any comments from the committee? I turn it back to the chair.
No.
Do we, I guess, do we have the actual names of the lobstermen who signed it?
I don't, I guess I'll
I can verify a number of them.
Okay, can you do it right? We might as well do it for the record right now also for the first.
Yeah, Mike Kelly, Barry Chetty Stratton, Lindsay McDaniels. Oh,
Carl Kelly?
I don't know, I can't verify he's a fisherman. And I have trouble reading the other one.
Terry Stanley,
He's not an officer.
Kyle Kelly,
Those 2 are, so 3, who's down, the next ones,
Something merchant.
then I don't know the 2 on the bottom.
Is that Ryan Graves?
Yeah, that's probably one, yeah.
John.
So
Okay.
how many of these lobstermen, how many folks on this list can you?
I can confirm 5.
5 are active fishermen in the area.
Yes.
go ahead.
I have one comment, actually, question, comment, but it seems like we keep referring back to the larger plan. And my understanding is that we're here strictly about the 4, so even the lobstermen's comments are based on their fear of much more. And there seems to also be an opportunity for compromise.
Well-
We're talking about the 4, and I thought that's what everyone would hear about.
We are, man, and that'll be the decision that the harbor committee makes. And I think we can probably weed through the rhetoric that we've had today.
My concern is we keep going back to this, and all the lobstermen, I'm sure, make their
Right.
opinion on that.
So I have no further questions.
Any questions for Mr. Blaine? from The committee? Yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, I have 1 more member of the association, and then Mr. Peacock, and I'll be done. Terry, Sears, are you here?
I am.
Okay. Terry, can you just state your name and where you live?
Terry Sears, 8 Barnacles Way.
Okay, and you're a member of the South Shore Cove Association?
Yes, as well as the fleet.
Okay. And you observed the 4 moorings because your property is relatively close to them, right?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall any incidents involving those moorings, or you felt that there was some concern worth informing people about?
Well, last August, there was an alarm that was going off, a very high pitched sound from one of the boats, and a bunch of neighbors thought it was coming from our home, but it was actually coming from one of the boats, and it happened multiple times. I called the fleet on both occasions that the alarm was there. I left messages for the fleet. I eventually called the harbor master, and they identified that it was an alarm going off in one of the boats, but it was something that wasn't fixed for, I would say 24 to 36 hours. So it was, on a weekend, something that did interfere with people's enjoyment of the weekend.
Does that give you much confidence in the claims from the fleet that they'll be able to closely monitor the situation here and respond to any incidents?
No, it doesn't, because the fleet is not open beyond a certain hour in the evening. And I had a neighbor come over at 10 o'clock at night saying, knocking on my door, saying your house alarm is going off. And I assured him that it was not my house alarm. It was out in the water, but we all know that sound travels in the water.
Thank you. So next question, you previously tried to build a dock in South Shore Cove, right?
Yes, I did. I applied for a permit at the encouragement of my neighbor, who was my brother. And it was a family sort of issue where I thought he encouraged me at that time to apply for a permit for a dock so that we could have separate docks. And at the time, it was, I didn't really understand. I hadn't taken occupancy of the house. The house was kind of billed as a tear down. And I had 4 young children and worked full time. And I just applied to see like, well, maybe we can have that optionality. As soon as I went to, I think the room that you're sitting in now and saw neighbors complaining, I withdrew it immediately. It was not something I was very motivated to do.
So do you agree now with the concerns that were raised then about your dock and the impact it would have on the code?
Well, I think for the gentleman who asked the question, if there are moorings there, why wouldn't there be docks eventually? I think that's a very good point. It's a short walk to the fleet for me now. I get that, but if conceivably there's boats that are yours right there, I could see people wanting a pier.
So I have no further questions for Ms. Sears. I would turn it to the committee.
Question, Jim. So you filed for a permit. Did you go through with the permit and were denied, or you just never pursued it?
No, never pursued it. I didn't realize that, it wasn't something, I hadn't had a waterfront property, and I didn't sort of understand how docks were viewed. It was back in 2004, 2005. As soon as I saw neighbors didn't like that, I said, oh, this is not important to me. Let's remove it.
You could have legally, as far as you know, gone through the process and probably gotten a dock permit, but it was your neighbors who didn't like it. That's
Yeah,
why
I have no idea of the chances of it going through.
Okay, thank
But
you.
I knew that I didn't want to live with neighbors who resented my decision.
See any other questions, John? John Loin, was it ever determined to your knowledge who that boat belonged to?
I do not know.
Was any member of the fleet ever made aware of who that boat belonged to?
I don't know.
I have a question for Terry.
No, we're gonna pause that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think my deputy can answer the question because he would have been on duty and received that call. Go ahead, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Adam Hurst, the deputy harbor master. Yeah, so I do remember getting that call, going out and checking it out. I think it was like she said, probably about a day or two later where we could find who it belonged to, and I believe it was Agnes Beal, her boat that was going off and had the alarm going off, so, but it was taken care of. I don't have any other incidents.
How did you learn that?
I believe you got the info from the fleet. From the fleet, yeah.
But it was on one of the 4 moorings.
Yes.
I'd like you to move on.
I'm done.
You're done.
Yeah, these are other people's questions.
No,
Or Mr. Still have Captain Peacock here?
I do, yes.
well, you're not done then.
You're not done. No, I have Captain Peacock. I was waiting for other people to ask their questions.
I'm gonna ask you to continue.
Yes, I'm ready to continue if you're done with the audience questions.
Yeah,
Okay, great. Captain Peacock, can you introduce yourself on record, please?
Thank you. My name's Robert Peacock. I'm from Eastport, grew up in Lubec. And when I was growing up in Lubec, we lived on a mud flat that was 3/4 of a mile long. And I thought then that the toughest job in Maine on the water was clamming in February up there, about half a mile. And having been around since 1971 dealing with town politics, especially around the water. I now think that being a harbor master is the toughest job in Maine, and that's what I do. Thank you.
Excellent. So can you explain a little bit of your professional background and how it would relate to the management of moorings and qualify you to speak on that?
Yeah, my family was in the siding business, and I grew up around the siding plant. I dove on weirs, dove on moorings when I was 15, started. We put moorings in the sardine carriers down by the weirs for the weir boats. Put my first mooring in for myself in 1971. It's still in the same position. I have it checked every 2 or 3 years. We change the chain or pull it up. So I now got about, I've probably done 30 or 40 moorings in my career. I went to Maine Maritime and shipped for 30 years, 25 years. I was in the Navy for 30 years, and I dealt with moorings, especially in the Navy, quite a bit, in the reserve. But I put in a research farm for urchins, and every mooring is there. They're still there to this day in probably 40 feet of water, where we had rafts that we made to do the research from. We put in an 8-ton rock for a larger boat that we were using for research, particularly in scallops. All this was for the state, so I've had a lot of experience with moorings, but it's in an area where we have today 22 feet of tide at this day, and the currents are pretty strong compared to what we have here in MPI. I've been a ship pilot since 1971 in the Great Lakes and around here. I did Bar Harbor for 25 years as a pilot on the ships. And I spent a lot of time in Southwest in my personal yacht in sardine carriers, and I was the pilot for the Seaborne Spirit, the Seaborne Pride, and I anchored right off that cove when we discharged the passengers to go ashore and ended up to Abel's with the ship. So I spent quite a bit of time in this area with both anchoring and mooring.
So are you familiar with South Shore Cove before you were retained?
A little bit, yeah. I've been by it in my yacht quite a few times, and sitting in the ship, we had a heavy sea coming in one day. We were rolling pretty good, enough so that we picked up the anchor. And we were less than a quarter of a mile from the end of South Cove. So I've seen what the swell can do with the right wind and the right tide and the right swell coming up through there. That can be a nasty place. I mean, it's protected from some directions, north, northeast, northwest. It's not bad, but boy, anything from the south particularly, southeast, southwest, then you can start getting a real mess in there.
So what did you do to prepare for getting, so correct to say that you were hired to evaluate whether there would or would not be any safety concerns or interference with uses related to these 4 moorings, is that right?
Yes, and I did some chart work just to see, remembering what happened on the Seaborne Spirit, why did that do what it did in that spot? And I drew that chart. Today, I went back, it's been a long time, so I rented a boat in Southwest this morning and came across and spent quite a bit of time going around the cove just to see what's there now. There was the four moorings, nothing was on them. There was one lobster trap, was all on, and that was it in the whole cove. There was nothing else in there. And I wanted to be sure that I could see what was going on. And I sat there and watched the currents, just let the boat drift and see what would happen around the moorings where the currents were, just to get familiarized with it.
Sure. What were your observations from that?
I think it's a timing issue with weather. That could be a perfect place for 80–90% of the time. But you let a hurricane come up the coast, and you get those swells coming up between the islands and into that cove, and you can wipe them right out.
You go to the testimony for Captain Peacock in the bookmark section. Exhibit I there. No, actually, sorry, can you? Yeah, let's go down. Exhibit J. Down, yep, right, up, yep. So is this what you're referring to, Bob?
Yes.
Sorry, okay.
And that shows you, there's nothing to stop any swell coming in there. All the way to England, to Europe, to Africa, it's gonna come up. And if you get just the right conditions, particularly when you get the wind against the tide and the swell against the wind, you can start building up some seas in there. And I'm sure you can get some huge seas going into that cove. So that's an issue where, you know, you want to risk it. And if you had a boat in there, how much time are you gonna take to get off it? And we just heard of a situation where there was something going on in a boat there for more than 24 hours and nobody did anything about it. So if you've got a storm coming up the coast, it doesn't have to be a hurricane, but storms generate swell. If you're in the Bahamas and you get a northeaster up here, you get the rage down there, and the rage can be 15-20 foot seas pounding into the Avalon Coast. It's the same way when you get a hurricane down there. There's Earl's down there right now, and we had swell up here on Sunday. So it doesn't have to be in the area. It can be 1,000 miles away, and you get it in the right direction up through that gut. Down there, you can have some real trouble.
And so can those conditions happen in July, August, or September?
When are you gonna have a hurricane? That's the question. If for those months, the southerly, sometimes in the afternoon, can get going really good up through there. The rest of the time, the easterlies, the southeast, it's more summertime. Winter's more north, and I think you're better off there with the northerlies in the winter than you would be with the southerlies in the summer. If you got boats in there, chances are you probably won't have a lot of boats on those moorings in the winter, but you never know.
So in terms of that, this code has been characterized as protected and an ideal location for moorings because of it being protected. Would you agree with that characterization?
No, it's the depth of the water. If you get a minus tide, as the harbor master said, you can get, if you got 10 feet, you can get down to 9, maybe 8.5. And you start a sea coming in at a 4-foot sea, and it starts pounding pretty soon. You can have a situation where those boats can get pounded and you'll see the boat end up ashore.
So what sort of characterizations do you look for in a suitable mooring location, and are those present here in South Shore Cove?
Well, not counting the eelgrass issue, which is a whole different world. When we put moorings in, and like I said, I'm in a different area with stronger tides and more current. But we look for a place that, what's the protection from the prevailing conditions? And making sure that when you put these in, what kind of bottom are you putting them on? That determines what kind of anchor are you going to use. And I got to tell you, we down east generally don't use anything except granite. And the more situation you have, the bigger the granite block you get, to the point where you use a barge or get it off the back of a dragger or something and then drop it. And generally, once the mooring goes down and it starts working its way in, you don't have to ever take the mooring up. You've got to change the chain, you got to change the shackle, you got to really inspect them every year or two to be sure they're okay. But the mooring block itself becomes more or less a permanent bottom fixture. So when you look at a cove or a mooring area, you look at all the environmental conditions that are going to affect your vessel. And then you determine how big a unit do I need. I mean, it could be the size of that desk right there. And you put that in with a couple of big rings coming up to it, and you're probably not going to have a problem unless you lose the chain or the rope. And it's always something that when you put a mooring in, you've got to look at the entirety of the area. And here, that southerly going in can really be a mess.
And what about the ledge habitat? Is that a suitable area for moorings?
Generally, we don't ever put a mooring on ledge. I mean, it's just going to drag. Even a big mooring like that size could drag on ledge. Depends on how is it got gravel on it that it could sink into a little on top of the ledge, or is it straight ledge? And it's better just to go where you've got a bottom that's soft, but the mooring can work itself into.
So moving on, did you review the Longsworth report and listen to his testimony today? Okay. So you were here for describing, there really has been no evidence of piers or moorings or other development in this cove, at least as far back as the 70s. And
I went by that cove on the ship in the 80s, and there was nothing in there. I mean, we were commenting on the bridge of the ship with a Norwegian captain we had. And he said, why is there all these yachts here and there's none there? And he said, is it the bottom or what? I said, it looks like there's nothing there. And since then, I've seen nothing. And I've been by it a lot.
so what does that suggest to you if you were evaluating it's suitable for moorings?
We've been on the Port Authority in Eastport. We decided to rebuild the pier, and we wondered, why did they build the pier here? And we look back, and over the last 150 years, the main pier in Eastport's been in the same place. Well, the reason is that's where the current splits. It's history, right? The reason there's been nothing in that cove is history. As they've had troubles there, I'm sure. As you said, those anchors in there. What happened to the ships that were on the other end of those anchors?
They didn't leave with anchor.
Maybe a lot of beams up there at the end of the cove someplace, but it's history is the guide to this. And the history of this is, there's been nothing in there for good reason. And it isn't just the last, since 1970. It goes way back beyond that. And it's, as the lady said, there might have been a coal dock in there, but once they stopped using coal, they didn't come in. And the question is, did they come in the coal dock when the weather was going to be bad or was bad? No, they surely didn't. So it's one of those issues where not knowing what was on the bottom as we do now, you give a good education to me on eelgrass. But having a place that has a history, having nothing is for a reason. What was the reason that it had nothing? There's been problems in there, I'm sure, in the past, and that's why nobody's put anything in there since.
And so the harbor master's decision discussed that these moorings were placed. You've reviewed the inspection reports, right?
Yes, I have.
I understand the specifications that were involved.
I was surprised that the specifications only called when you got the granite, which is what I'm used to, for 750-pound rock for a 30-foot or less boat. That, to me, anywhere is not enough. You need at least a 2-ton rock. Be sure that's going to stay there, minimum. And I'm not talking about the compensating spiral drilled in anchors, which we have used a lot of in back, which is interesting. But there, the problem is, if you don't take care of those bungee cords that are going up, and that's almost, I'd say every 2 years max, and they break and the whole thing's gone. So it's an issue. Everything has its benefits and its detriments, and certainly the compensating issues are much better for the bottom. But boy, when they break, and everything's gone.
Right, just because you're referring to the conservation moorings.
Yes, exactly.
So your safety concerns might be even greater with the use of conservation moorings?
Not if they use them, maybe okay, as long as they're inspected on a regular basis. And I mean inspected, and it's hard to tell if they got a crack in them or something, it's hard to know.
So the harbor master's decision was based on observations over one season. Do you think that's sufficient and observe no incidents? Do you think that's sufficient to evaluate safety here?
No, I think you've got to look at things over a longer period of time, because our weather, as we all know, are having huge cycle swings. And some years we have a great winter, and other years we get terrible winters. And I don't think we had a terrible winter last year going in there from there. It's something to watch.
And in determining a suitable location for a mooring, do you think safety considerations are, you talked about safety, environmental, are there other considerations you need to take into account, such as existing uses and how it's valued by the public?
There's one issue that hasn't been mentioned, and that's where you put these moorings. You got to get out to them and get a boat, small boat to get out to them and get back. So where you put the mooring, as harbor masters well know, if you've got a place that's got a lot of tide or wind or swell, seas coming in, and you're trying to get out of a yacht or lobster boat into a small boat, it's dangerous. So where you put those moorings needs to be protected so that you can get in or out, because I've seen, 4 people, I've taken 2 bodies out of the water where people fell out of boats, yachts, trying to get into that dinghy, and it was rough, and they flipped over, and that was the end of them. And I didn't see them, but 2 other friends died in a lobster boat, same thing. And the water's so cold around here. I don't care if it's dead of summer or dead of winter, it's cold. And you go in and you don't have very long. And so it's important to have a place wherever you have moorings that people can get to. The next thing is, how many boats are around, how many other moorings, how many other people? And you get isolated moorings and with nobody around, and you go over, you're dead. Where you have a lot of moorings, like on the other side, you can get back to Cove, then you've got a chance where somebody might see you, you can hold on long enough till they get there. So those are the things that they don't write them up in the book. And when you get in and out of a boat, that's a critical issue.
Thank you. Mooring plans. Are you familiar with mooring plans?
Yes,
Okay, how would you describe them?
the mooring plan is where the central authority, in this case, the harbor master, gets everybody together involved, the neighbors, the people using it on a regular basis that are going through it, the people that want to use it, and the type of boats that want to use it, and you start building a plan together where everybody is involved with it. And then once you get a general consensus of what you want, and you're never going to get 100% agreement, this is Maine, right? Never going to happen. But when you get a good consensus, then you take it to the harbor committee or to the town committee, depending on what town you're in, and go from there. But it's a plan that has to be all inclusive.
And do you think a mooring plan, in your opinion, based on the circumstances that we've discussed here, was needed?
Obviously, just look at the number of people that showed up today. It's something that I think could have been worked out in a different way, had there been more planning put into it.
And so there's been a dispute ongoing throughout this committee about whether we should just be looking at the 4, or we should be looking at more. Do you think it makes sense when it's clear that a proposal of 4 moorings is presented in the context of larger moorings to just put on blinders and look at one section, or should you consider this holistically and try a mooring plan?
As the chairman said, I would just look at the 4 because that's what you're looking at. The rest of it, I wouldn't make a comment. I'm not from Mount Desert, and if I was in Lubac or Eastport, I'd make a comment.
But in terms of, if you're generally speaking, right, and you're looking at whether a cove is suitable for moorings, or developing a mooring plan, would you just consider 1 or 2? Would you?
I think
consider
you're
what's
leading the gentleman.
Okay, do we have rules of evidence here?
That's a term I'm not familiar with.
He's
Speaking like a
been
lawyer.
asking leading questions the whole night, so I don't think.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think I've been pretty generous with my time.
Fair enough, I'll move on.
I think you should. We have another party that would like to make some presentations, and
Understood. So just let's get to your ultimate conclusions here. Do you reviewed the ordinance, right?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so you reviewed the standards that discuss whether it would detract from the tidal waters and have jeopardized the safety.
Yes.
Is it, in your opinion, should these moorings have been granted?
No, they shouldn't have. And now that we know about the eelgrass, that adds a, which obviously the harbor master didn't know. So that adds a whole new wrinkle into it.
Okay. I have nothing further.
any questions from anybody?
I just asked a question that his testimony kind of brought up. And I couldn't find it in the material, was the size of the current mooring blocks. And I didn't get that an Army Corps copy of the permit, which would have had that. They're in Reverend Mitchell's submission, the mooring inspection sheet and my permit. Yeah, but it doesn't give the weight of the rock. Almost certainly.
If you go to exhibit B,
Where is it? I'll read them off to you. I just got the mooring permit, just looking for the size. Goes down. So, number 296, the minimum spec on that mooring would be 750 pounds. That mooring is 1,750 pounds above spec.
Where is it on the weight on this full sheet?
750 pounds is the minimum spec for a 200 series mooring. It's right there at the top. It says the weight of the mooring.
On
Number
this one?
296 is 2,500. Keep going for the mooring inspection form.
Okay.
Number 296 is 2,500 pounds. Number 290, I'm sorry, I was looking at the last one. 295 is 1,500 pounds. 294 is 2,600 pounds. And 293 is 1,650. Putting the smallest one at double the size of our specifications. So would that meet your? And the chain size is also above specifications on all of them. One of them actually has an above specification tenant.
But they're all different.
They are, it's hard to get a piece of granite that's, you know.
Yeah, no, I get it. But they're all about way above what I'm trying to.
They are at least double for the minimum, some are triple.
To answer your question. I don't have experience with the size of anchors that you need to drag around here. So he does. So if he says that it's double the size, it's probably okay. If you were bringing that down east, you can be a lot bigger than that. But it's a different area.
Yeah, I was just getting at that. It's larger.
I don't
than
have the
our
knowledge,
requirement.
he does.
Okay, thank you very much.
Rick, I had a question for Terry. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Howard.
Okay, thanks. Terry, are you still available?
I am. I'm
Okay,
still
great.
available.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I just had a quick question based on your testimony. It's sort of just, you know, a what if, but if you could give me your best guess, I'd appreciate it. And that's that if the moorings were put in place there, would you feel any, you know, more impetus to go for a dock and at that time? Because, you know, because now there's boats in there. I just want to know what your feelings are towards that. And if you would be, you know, looking towards that in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think I intimated that when I said,
Yeah.
you know, if there's boats there, you know, you just are very proximate to them. And why spend 5 minutes walking around? So I would think if there are 4, I mean, again, I'm the type of person, I don't want to do things neighbors and people resent. A
Right.
happy life is my objective. So, you know, I kind of get it. I've lived in their home for 15 years and I also want to say boats cutting in between Gilpatrick's Ledge and the shore to get to Gilpatrick's Cove. And I always think, given tidal changes that are pretty dramatic, that seems an extra danger to have boats cutting in between the ledge, sometimes late at night, you know,
Sure.
and it's,
I'm more interested though in your aspect of getting, would you be inclined to, you know, go for a permit for a dock? That was really my question.
you know, and
I think
again,
you've answered it. So yeah.
yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, thanks, Howard.
Any other questions for Captain Peacock?
John, I guess one quick question. Captain Peacock, how many other moorings would you guesstimate are on the coast of Maine that would be in similar situations to these? I know multiple moorings in town that when there's a storm coming, people clear their moorings, they go find a safer location or they pull their boats.
That's. I do the same.
Yes.
So,
And
I know hurricanes come, I go to Tampa Bell.
A prudent boater pays attention or pays someone to pay attention to take care of the boat if there's impending weather, right?
Correct.
I mean, there's even moorings in Northeast Harbor out towards the head of the harbor that people clear when we get a good southeasterly storm. It is very open to the southeasterly, just like the South Shore Cove. So it's a common thing to have moorings in places that aren't necessarily ideal, but people pay attention and take care of the boat, get out of danger when it's coming.
And I got some photographs here, and they don't.
Oh, yes. It happens everywhere. Or lack of maintenance. Well, why wouldn't you put them down the shore where it's safer than in the bad spot?
Okay, I think we should move on. It's only fair to allow the other side to make a presentation. We've been very generous with our time for you folks, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to. Excuse me? Okay, all right. John, I'll ask you to speak first before the fleet.
I guess just a brief overview, John Loyne, Harbor Master. The fleet came to me in spring 21 with a request for 8 moorings. I worked with Gordon Beck and Franny Charles. I made a determination at that time that I wasn't comfortable giving them 8 moorings. I decided to give them 4 moorings as a test run to see how they would fare over a year. We did that. I had them inspected. I inspected them myself multiple times over the course of the year. Found there was no damage to the moorings. There was, other than one incident where one of the boats had a VHF that was set to squelch and it was making a ton of noise or whatever it happened to be. That was the only complaint that my office received over the course of the year. We received no other concerns or complaints about the moorings until the fleet came back in early of 22 and made a request for a large ask of up to 30 moorings. At that point, the process turned into well, I had brought them to the Harbor Committee to get some guidance from the Harbor Committee. As the ordinance states that I can bring stuff to other boards and stuff to help with a decision, because it wasn't a decision that I was comfortable making on my own for a large ask like that. And it has rolled into where we are now. In June, I permitted these moorings permanently under my observations. I haven't witnessed any safety concerns. Safety concerns of boats traveling between the ledge and the shore is, you know, it's not an ideal thing. With local knowledge, people go through places that you wouldn't that I wouldn't necessarily go to. I don't have any knowledge of transiting between that ledge and the shore. It only takes a minute to go around it. Other than that, I mean, we've gotten to where we are. There hasn't been a lot said or done about these moorings over the course of this summer. I've witnessed no other safety concerns during this summer. The Army Corps permits for them are still in process. I tried to reach out today to find out where they are. I got no response from the Army Corps today. But you know, these moorings were all oversized. That was done on purpose to prevent anything from happening, adding extra safety to them. And, you know, not having line of sight on a mooring, that's a luxury. There are thousands and thousands of moorings up and down the coast of Maine that people's boats are not visible from their house or from, you know, anything that can't think of the right word, but there just is. There's a lot of moorings that people don't have line of sight on their equipment. By doing their normal inspections and keeping up their gear, You know, you can go home and sleep safe at night, knowing that your boat is safe on your mooring. You know, a prudent boater during weather or knows weather is coming is going to do something by shoring up their lines or having the boat move to a new location or pulling it completely out of the water. That's about the extent of what I got. I guess I'm open to any questions.
Questions from the board? Questions from the public?
I have a couple questions. Just John, so you talked about the safety concern. You reviewed it and provided what your observations are regarding safety.
Yeah.
And what about navigation?
I mean, I've been out around the Moorings, probably close to a dozen times. You know, I don't find them to be in the way of navigation. I navigate inside this congested harbor all the time, and I've never had an issue, and I'm navigating around hundreds of moorings. Those 4 moorings in that cove, in my opinion, don't impact navigation. Lobster fishermen fish around them. Lobster fishermen fish around the hundreds of moorings inside Northeast Harbor every day in the summer. So I don't see that as a factor. It's, you know, the congestion level versus those 4 out there. I don't think they're competing on anything for the commercial fishermen. And in my opinion, as a diver, moorings provide another habitat for lobsters, and a lot of the fishermen will fish closer to the moorings than they probably should because of that.
Other questions?
So we should allow the South Shore Cove to ask some questions.
Okay.
I just have a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I have a question also. And
Uh,
I've had my hand raised.
Was it?
Hi, it's Sarah Contamiclos. I live on South Shore Road. I'm also a member of the fleet. And I just wanted to clarify what the harbor master just said, because I understood, and it sounds like I understood incorrectly, that part of this started was the harbor master had asked the fleet to rein in some of the moorings that were existing that had gone out too close to greenings and were impeding traffic. Is that not correct?
That was done after the fleet brought the ask for the larger amount of moorings. The first time the harbor committee saw it, they expressed their concerns with the expanse of the fleet's mooring field in Gilpatrick's Cove, and asked them to come back to us the following month with some sort of plan to pull that back in. And that's when they came back with the plan for the 30. 15 of them would have been relocation moorings to get out of the existing field on the outer side, and 15 of them would have been new additional moorings.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you. Just a couple quick questions. These are permits that allow commercial rentals, right?
That's correct.
Are there any restrictions on that as to who they can rent it to?
No, there is not. Clifton Dock has moorings in Northeast Harbor. They primarily rent to members of the fleet, but when they have the availability, they rent to transient people that come and go as needed, as available.
Okay. So are there any restrictions on there about having local knowledge? Like, in order to rent this, you must have local knowledge of the code.
You mean a renter?
Right.
I would say no. Not that I'm aware of. I don't require someone to have local knowledge to rent a mooring inside Northeast Harbor. I get people that show up that have been coming here for 40 years. I get people that show up and this is their first time ever. I don't restrict them because of that.
Right, and that's why there are no restrictions on the mooring permits as well. Okay. The only restriction is a 30-foot or less. class vessel.
That's exactly right. They're all four of them are 200 series moorings, so anything under 29 feet, 11 inches. I mean, they could put a 10-foot boat on there if they want, but they cannot exceed their 29.11.
Is there a requirement that it has to be pretty boats only?
No.
Okay. And have you discussed with the Army Corps the eelgrass findings from Sept?
I have not spoken with the Army Corps since that came out.
Okay. And did you have any conversations with the code enforcement officer about the expansion of use of the fleet?
No, I did not.
I have no
Yes.
question.
As far as I know, it's not a requirement for me to have a conversation with any other department to issue a mooring permit.
Okay.
The state and the Army Corps grant me the ability to permit moorings as I see fit, I guess, or, you know.
But does the ordinance authorize you and say that you may consult with other agencies as you see a need?
It does, yeah, and it also says that I may create a mooring plan if I see it necessary. Now, for the 4 moorings that are there, I don't see the mooring plan and a traffic plan is necessary. If we were to look at the potential for 30 moorings, that is a different result. Then yes, a mooring plan and a traffic plan would be necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Public questions for John? The harbor master? No. Would the fleet like to make a presentation, or would you like to take a break?
No, I think we're all trying to get done. And so I'll be quite brief. Thank you very much. Thank you all for taking the time, not only tonight, but to read the amount of material that you've gotten. So thank you very much for that. I'm Mia Thompson. I'm the Commodore of the Northeast Harbor Fleet. And I just wanted to say that we thank you all, and we've been a fleet and involved in this town for over 100 years. And we have a strong commitment to this town, as you know, and we want to continue that. And thank you everybody for their time for that. So as John said, in early 21, we came to them asking for some moorings. And as a result of that conversation, he advised us that he felt that 4 was the appropriate amount to put in at that time. When we put them in, as we do with all of our current moorings, we do our best to exceed the standards of the Harbor Committee. And we change according to Fran Charles, the general manager of the fleet, we changed our chain more often than the town requires. And we try to exceed our mooring size just for the extra safety of that. Our intention is simple. Why we were asking for the 4 moorings is because there is a need for moorings. As you probably know, that this town has on its waiting list 251 people wanting moorings just in the town of Mount Desert. And 112 of those are just in Northeast Harbor. And our fleet has a waiting list of 38 people. So we're just trying to alleviate that. It couldn't be more simple than that. And our goal is to, we hope that you will allow these 4 moorings to stay as they are. If they need to be adjusted in GPS location to accommodate your findings and you feel that that's appropriate, we're happy to accommodate that. We want to do what's best for the area. If there were bad weather, we are in full alert. Most boats and the owners decide to take them out of harm's way, whether they're on Gilpatrick or the Northeast. They go up to Stonesville, they get pulled out. It's a full court press to assist that. The moorings are only used primarily 8 to maybe 10 weeks a year. So the up and down movement and the wear and tear is rather minimal based on 52 weeks. So the only thing that I want to say is that the ordinance as it reads, the purpose of the ordinance, page 5, section 2.3 of the Harbor Ordinance, and I quote, is to provide for a just and orderly operation and regulation of marine activities on and within the harbors and all tidal waters of the town of Mount Desert, in order to ensure safety to persons and property, to promote availability and use of a valuable public resource, and to create a fair and efficient framework for the administration of that resource. I believe we sum this up by saying that we are a fleet who wants boat safety, and we strive to work with the town to do that and the harbor. These 4 moorings are in the tidal waters of Mount Desert. They have been permitted for the guidance of this ordinance. There's a period of inspection and observation, as John indicated, and we thought that was a prudent idea. This is the new area. Let's do that. No problem. Our objections, no objections for the entire time that those moorings were in for that whole summer. We heard nothing of any objections. We did have the squelch issue with the VHF. Grant Charles and Harbor Master, we finally figured out where it was coming from and resolved it as quickly as we could. Certainly something we didn't want to have anybody annoyed by. Yeah, as you saw when we went out on the boat the other day, and Rick, thank you again for taking us all out there. That cove is a protected cove. It's the 4 moorings are tucked very far in there. It's navigable, and there is some significant, oh my gosh, end of the day, sufficient depth of water there for the boats that are being placed on there. And that is all part of responsible boating and organization to make sure that the boats appropriately fit the moorings that are there and the size, and we're regulated to 29.11 feet, 11 inches. And not only do we accommodate that, but we also look at the area and whatnot. As a mariner, I would have no problem anchoring in that cove. It's protected and it's got depth, and I could have easy swing. So, and it matches Article 3 of the Harbor Ordinance, particularly Section 3.2, the general duties and responsibility of paragraph 1, promote the order and assure safety and use of the general public. The Northeast Harbor Fleet hopes that you vote to keep these 4 moorings permanent as such. And thank you very much for your time and all your effort with regards to this.
Questions from Mia?
I don't know who are you calling on me? It's Sarah Contamiklos again. I actually have a statement, not a question. May I say it?
Not right
No.
now, Sarah. If there's no questions from the committee, questions from the South Shore Cove Association.
Just one factual question. I'll let my brief stand for the legal arguments in response to those. Just the question was, did you, before requesting the 4 moorings were installed, did you reach out to any of the shoreline owners on the cove?
No.
That's all I have.
Yeah, and just for history, that's never been ever done before. So it's never, and for all the moorings that we have.
Sure.
John, do you have a question?
Do not.
Well, I have a question at this point. I just want to make sure. I don't believe it's a requirement to reach out to the landowners abutting a mooring field. Is that correct?
I'll concede that.
Okay. Agreed.
Oh, okay. Okay, great.
If there are no other questions from the committee or the public, I'm gonna ask that this hearing be drawn to a close.
Can I just say one thing? It's 3 sentences.
Sarah, one moment, please.
I'm sorry, I've listened through this entire thing. I do feel like I'm gonna say these three
One
sentences.
moment, please. Can you mute her? We should allow this Sarah and others 3 minutes. Any members of, is Sarah a member of the association, Stephen? She's part of the Northeast Harbor Fleet, okay. So are there any member, let's get a hand count real quick. How many people from the public that are not members of the South Shore Cove Association that would like to provide public comment here tonight?
Have one hand.
One hand, and then how many on Zoom? We've got Sarah. Is there anyone else on Zoom that would like to provide public comment tonight on this matter?
In that case, Sarah, you can go first because you raised your hand first.
Okay.
Let's, we're gonna keep it to 3 minutes, Sarah.
It will be less. Thank you very much for that. I just have to say I'm Sarah Contamiklos. I live on South Shore Road. I'm a member of the fleet. I'm one of those 38 people that has been on the waiting list for a mooring for years for my Mercury, which I would be happy to have in the Cove. My statement is part of what draws people to beautiful Northeast Harbor is yachting, which is also an important local economy. The Atlantic Ocean belongs to all of us. This discussion is part of a larger conversation on the island about how to manage the extraordinary growth of the summer community over the last years, which has greatly impacted all of us. For 100 years, the Northeast Harbor Fleet has been a welcoming and integral part of our community. I sincerely hope we can find a way forward which supports Northeast Harbor and its institutions as a whole, rather than simply accommodating a few.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Sarah.
Go ahead.
As I said, my name is Peter Rogers, former full-time resident of Northeast Harbor. I'm here much of the year, member of the fleet. And I just wanted to say that I've read through the objections from August 10th. And wanted to say that they really, they didn't resonate for me. The response by the fleet I found extremely credible. I did a little bit of research. I'm not an attorney, nor am I a scientist. But going back as far as 1647, when the colonial ordinances, followed by the public trust doctrine, there is a fair bit of case law that does not involve so much the water beyond the low tide line, but the intertidal waters. And even intertidal waters are reserved for use for fishing, fouling, and navigation, which, according to some of the case law, appears to include mooring. And we're talking about water that's even beyond the low tide line. So it strikes me that this is something that A, does not require the permission of the people who live along the water, and B, is really not an issue that is controlled by any sort of legal protection of you. Thank you.
Great. I'm going to close the hearing. And I'm going to ask our committee if they would like to take a vote tonight, or you would like to postpone this for a special meeting, let's say within the next 2 weeks.
Go with the latter. I would go with the latter of the choices.
Are you going to make a motion?
Motion. So moved.
For what?
To the 2 weeks? To the 2 weeks. I agree. I second it.
It's moved and seconded that we postpone a decision for a special meeting 2 weeks from today. Is that understood? All in favor of the motion, raise your hand or say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, it passed.
Thank you very much for everything. This has been a long evening and we really appreciate your hard work.
So just on that, so we're saying 2 weeks from tonight, so 4:30 on Tuesday, the 27th. I don't know if my math is right. I think it's 14 days today. Okay, so.
And it can only last a half hour, right?
Yeah, so in that time, you guys are kind of like a sequestered jury now. So you should not discuss what was presented here tonight with anyone else in the public or among yourselves in any way. You're allowed to review all the information that's been presented to you and think about it, but any deliberation or discussion on this needs to be done in an open meeting, a public meeting, which will be 2 weeks from tonight. So again, I'm the stickler for the rules here, but we got to make sure we do that to be compliant to the main public Freedom of Access Act requirements of the committee. So, if anyone comes up to you in the street and says, hey, I think blah, 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 just say, hey, you had your chance at the hearing, and then we'll talk about it in 2 weeks. And then everything should be discussed, what you've heard tonight, pros and cons, all that, and then you'll make a deliberation as a public body in a public meeting.
Go ahead.
Just a point of clarification, that meeting in 2 weeks it's open to the public, is it open to public comment?
No, the public hearing is closed, so all public comment and testimony is submitted, we're done. Now it's kind of the jury's out, and 12 angry men, you get to watch the 11 wise and prudent harbor committee members make their deliberation, but it's in public.
So I'm gonna take from our motion that we're adjourning. I'm not gonna take up anything else here, which is discussion of old business or anything else you guys would want to bring up. I assume. we'll
Motion
just-
to adjourn by you.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, raise your hand.
Aye.
I think we had a quick question.
May I submit my notes that I just,
Sure. If you put it in printed form for everybody. Thank you.
Rick, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for your time. I really do
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
it's, I don't have to take them. I think it's set up. And I actually. I don't know.